There is a symbol older than any nation, older than any army, older than the very concept of war as we have come to organize it. A skull, two crossed bones beneath it. For centuries, it appeared on pirate flags, on poison bottles, on the gates of cemeteries. A universal shorthand for one simple truth, that what lies beyond this point can kill you. Armies have worn it on their caps and collars throughout history, often as a mark of elite status, a deliberate courting of mortality that soldiers found romantic, even noble. But in the Germany of the 1930s, that ancient symbol was taken, reshaped, and fused to something that had never existed before, in quite the same form. An ideological killing machine that wore its purpose on its collar, literally, in silver thread. This is the story of the SS Totenkopf Division, the Death's Head Division. It is not a comfortable story. It is not meant to be. And if you are settling in for the night, finding a quiet position, letting the weight of the day begin to drain away, then you have chosen, perhaps without fully realizing it, to spend the next several hours inside one of the most complex and troubling military histories of the 20th century. A history that moves from the watchtowers of concentration camps to the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, from the roads of northern France to the burning plains of Ukraine, from the relative order of a functioning war machine to the absolute chaos of a collapsing empire. And threaded through all of it, never absent for a single chapter, the question that historians and moralists alike have wrestled with ever since. How do you reckon with an organization that was, simultaneously, a highly effective military formation and an active participant in systematic atrocity? That question does not have a clean answer, and this documentary will not pretend otherwise. What we will do, across 18 chapters that span the full life of this division, from its earliest origins to its final surrender, is follow the evidence, the records, the testimony, the verified, documented history of men who were shaped by one of the most deliberately brutalizing ideological systems ever constructed, and what that system produced when it was handed tanks, artillery, and a continent to fight across. We begin not on a battlefield, but inside a camp, because the Totenkopf Division did not emerge from a military academy or a proud regimental tradition. It emerged from the concentration camp system. The men who would form its first ranks were guards, men trained not to fight soldiers, but to control, degrade, and brutalize prisoners. Their commanding officer, Theodor Eicke, was not a general in any conventional sense. He was an administrator of suffering, a man who had built the camp apparatus from a relatively small early facility into an expanding network, and who had personally executed the head of the SA on Himmler's orders during the Night of the Long Knives. This was the founding culture. This was the soil in which the Death's Head Division grew. Understanding that origin is not optional, it is essential, because everything that followed, every tactical decision, every atrocity, every act of brutal endurance in the mud of the Eastern Front, flows directly from what these men were before they were soldiers. And yet, the story of the Totenkopf Division is also, on a purely operational level, a story of transformation that military historians find genuinely striking. A formation that began as a collection of poorly regarded camp guards, openly mocked by professional Wehrmacht officers, as political amateurs who had no business on a real battlefield, would be rebuilt over 4 years of catastrophic combat into one of the most capable armored divisions the German military ever fielded. Not because its ideology was correct, not because its crimes were somehow redeemed by battlefield performance, but because war, particularly the merciless, total war of the Eastern Front, is an extraordinarily efficient, if monstrous, educator. The men who survived the Luga River, who endured the Demyansk pocket, who came out the other side of Kharkov and Kursk. They learned, they adapted, they became, in the purely technical vocabulary of armored warfare, expert. That contrast between the crimes they carried with them and the competence they developed is what makes the Totenkopf Division so persistently difficult to reduce to simple categories. And it is why, decades after the last of its survivors have passed, historians continue to study it. Over the course of this documentary, you will follow the division through every major phase of its existence. You will be in France, in the late spring of 1940, on a road outside a farmhouse where nearly 100 British prisoners of war were shot in cold blood, an act that would eventually bring its perpetrators before a court. You will cross the Soviet border in the summer of 1941 and feel the almost immediate shattering of the assumptions the men carried with them from their easy victory in the West. You will spend the worst winter of the war trapped inside the Demyansk pocket, surrounded, starving, and sustaining losses that would have destroyed a lesser formation entirely. You will watch the division's founding commander, a man both feared and genuinely loved by his troops, meet his end in the skies over Soviet territory. You will witness the rebuilding, the tanks, the new equipment, the hardened survivors, fused with fresh recruits into something faster and more lethal than what had existed before. And you will follow the long retreat, from Kursk back through Ukraine, through Hungary, through the wreckage of Spring Awakening, to the final desperate march westward, through a Reich that was ceasing to exist around them. It is a long journey, across years and thousands of kilometers, and an almost incomprehensible accumulation of loss. And it ends not in triumph for anyone, but in surrender, in trials, in the slow reckoning of post-war justice, and in the equally slow reckoning of historical understanding. If you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly this kind of deep, unhurried exploration of history, the kind that takes the full measure of a subject, rather than reaching for easy conclusions. If this is the kind of history that keeps your mind engaged as the world outside goes quiet, then take a moment now and subscribe. There is a great deal more where this comes from, and if you are a returning listener, then you already know what is ahead. Hours of carefully researched, thoughtfully told history that is designed to be with you through the long, still hours of the night. Get settled, take a breath. Let whatever you have been carrying today begin to set itself down. The story of the Death's Head Division is about to begin, and it begins, as so many stories of the Second World War do, not with a dramatic military moment, but with a choice. The choice made by a state, a bureaucracy, and ultimately by individual men, to build something that should never have been built. To take the worst impulses of an ideology and give them a uniform, a symbol, and a war to fight. This is the complete history of the SS Totenkopf Division. Settle in. There is a particular kind of institution that does not emerge from tradition or necessity alone. It is built, deliberately and with cold patience, around a single idea, that loyalty to one man, one movement, one symbol, can replace every other foundation a fighting force might stand on. The SS Totenkopf Verbände, the formation that would eventually become one of the most feared and most condemned divisions of the Second World War, began not on a battlefield, but inside the wire of a concentration camp. It began with guards. It began with ideology. And it began with Heinrich Himmler, who understood before almost anyone else in the Nazi state that violence, properly organized and properly believed in, could be turned into something resembling a religion. Himmler's vision for the SS had always been larger than its origins suggested. What had started in the late 1920s as a personal bodyguard for Adolf Hitler, a few hundred men in black uniforms standing at podiums and lining corridors, had, by the early 1930s, grown into something far more ambitious. Himmler was not a soldier. He had no combat record, no instinctive feel for tactics or terrain. What he possessed instead was an extraordinary gift for bureaucratic empire building and a belief, absolute and unshakable, that the Germanic race required a new kind of warrior class, men who had been shaped from the inside out, whose obedience was not merely professional but existential. The concentration camp system that began to take form after 1933 gave him the raw material he needed. The camps needed guards. That much was simple and practical. But Himmler refused to treat the task of guarding as a menial or secondary function within the SS structure. He saw in it something else entirely, a proving ground. The men who stood watch over the enemies of the Reich, who administered punishment, who enforced the daily machinery of dehumanization, would, if properly cultivated, become hardened in a way that no conventional military training could replicate. They would learn to regard human suffering without flinching. They would internalize the ideology not as an abstraction, but as a lived daily reality. By the mid-1930s, Himmler was actively recruiting for what he formally designated the SS Totenkopf Division, the Death's Head units, giving official shape and name to what had already been growing organically within the camp system. Recruitment was selective in ways that went well beyond the physical standards Himmler publicly championed. Yes, he wanted tall men, fair men, men who could pass the racial criteria his office had elaborated in painful pseudoscientific detail. But he also wanted men with a specific psychology, men who were either already committed ideological believers or who could be made into them. Young men from struggling rural backgrounds, from communities where the economic collapse of the Weimar years had left deep wounds, were disproportionately represented. They were offered uniforms, wages, meals, belonging, and above all, purpose. The SS gave them an enemy and told them that standing guard over that enemy was an act of patriotic service. Many of them believed it. Some had believed something like it long before they enlisted. The indoctrination that followed enlistment was systematic and total. Recruits were immersed in a curriculum that blended racial ideology with a mythology of Germanic warrior tradition, reaching back through centuries of selective and largely invented history to frame the SS man as the modern incarnation of an ancient martial brotherhood. Lectures on racial biology sat alongside physical training and weapons drill. Obedience was not merely demanded, it was philosophically justified. The recruit was taught that his individual conscience was a weakness, that the higher collective will of the movement superseded any private moral hesitation. The skull and crossbones insignia that the Totenkopf Division wore, the Totenkopf itself, was presented not as a symbol of death in the ordinary sense, but as a reminder of willingness to sacrifice, to kill, and to die without sentiment. It was meant to signal that the man wearing it had moved beyond ordinary human compunction. The skull as a symbol had a long history in European military tradition. Prussian hussars had worn it, and various irregular formations had adopted it across centuries of warfare. Himmler knew this. He leaned into the historical resonance deliberately, framing his death's head men as heirs to a tradition of elite, ruthless military service. But the symbol meant something specific and different in the context of the concentration camps. The men who wore it did not wear it in combat, not yet. They wore it while standing over prisoners. They wore it while administering beatings. They wore it at roll calls that lasted for hours in the cold. watching men collapse. The skull on the collar was not a memory of past battles. It was present tense. It was operational. Into this environment, Himmler placed the man who would become the defining figure of the entire Totenkopf formation, Theodor Eicke. Eicke was in several respects an unlikely architect of anything. His early life had been marked by instability, professional failure, and a volatile temperament that had, at various points, landed him in a psychiatric facility. He had served in the First World War, drifting afterward through a succession of positions that never quite held him. He was a man of grievances, of fierce loyalties, and fiercer hatreds, who had found in National Socialism not merely a political home, but a complete identity. When he was appointed Commandant of Dachau, the first of the major concentration camps, in the summer of 1933, he finally had the institution his character required. What Eicke built at Dachau became the template for the entire camp system. He introduced a formal set of regulations governing punishment, precise, written down, bureaucratically neat, that gave the machinery of cruelty the appearance of order and legitimacy. Prisoners were not beaten arbitrarily, at least not officially. They were punished according to a schedule of offences and consequences that Eicke had drafted personally. This was not accidental. By formalizing the violence, Eicke made it easier for guards to participate in it without feeling personally responsible. The system absorbed the guilt. The individual guard was simply following procedure. Himmler recognized the genius of this approach immediately, and within a short time, Eicke was elevated to inspector of concentration camps and chief of the SS Guard formations, effectively the commander of every camp guard unit in the Reich. From that position, Eicke reshaped the guard formations in his own image. He traveled between camps, inspecting, berating, demanding higher standards of ideological commitment and personal toughness. He had no patience for sentiment, and none whatsoever for guards he considered soft. His preferred vocabulary of criticism was contempt. He spoke of weakness and cowardice as the worst of possible sins, and he spoke of hardness as the highest of virtues. The men under him learned to perform that hardness, at minimum, and many came to genuinely embody it. By the second half of the 1930s, the SS Totenkopf numbered in the tens of thousands, divided into regional formations, trained to a common standard, indoctrinated according to a common curriculum, and loyal. Eicke made certain of this. Not to the Wehrmacht, not to the army, not to any conventional military structure, but to the SS and to Himmler personally. The relationship between the Totenkopfverbände and the regular German military was, from the beginning, one of mutual suspicion, shading toward contempt. The Wehrmacht's officer corps was largely drawn from established families with long military traditions. They looked at Eicke's men and saw what the evidence broadly supported: political soldiers, ideological enforcers, men whose training had been built around guarding prisoners rather than fighting armies. The contempt ran in the other direction as well, though for different reasons. Eicke taught his men to view the conventional military establishment as decadent, as insufficiently committed to the ideological struggle, as men playing at soldiering according to outdated rules. This tension between the SS formations and the Wehrmacht would run as a constant current through the Totenkopf's entire history, erupting in open friction and quiet sabotage at various points across the coming years. By the time war became a practical reality in the late 1930s, Himmler had been maneuvering to ensure that his formations would have a combat role. He wanted the SS to be a military force as well as a police and ideological one. He wanted it to bleed, to prove itself on the battlefield, to accumulate the kind of honor that only combat could confer. The Totenkopfverbände were earmarked as the core of what would become a frontline division. The camp guards would become soldiers. The men who had spent years mastering the enforcement of suffering behind wire fences would be handed rifles and artillery pieces and pointed at an actual enemy. Eike had already begun to orient his training toward that end, pushing his men through increasingly military exercises, acquiring weapons, running field drills. The Death's Head insignia would travel with them from the camps to the battlefield, from the watchtowers to the trenches, carrying with it every habit and every conviction that the camp years had formed. This was not an ordinary military genealogy. Most divisions in most armies trace their origins to earlier regiments, earlier battles, earlier generations of professional soldiers, whose institutional knowledge passes forward through time. The Totenkopf carried a different inheritance. Its founding culture was not the culture of a barracks or a parade ground or a staff college. It was the culture of the camps, of systematic degradation, of formalized cruelty, of men trained to regard certain categories of human beings as existing outside the ordinary obligations of conscience. When those men went to war, they brought that culture with them. They brought it to France, to the Soviet Union, to Hungary, to the final collapse in Austria. They brought it to every engagement and every crime that would fill the chapters of their history. It did not begin with a battle order. It began with a skull on a collar, and a man named Eike, and a system that taught young men the most dangerous lesson of all, that what they were doing was not wrong, but necessary, that it was, in fact, a virtue. When the camps produced their soldiers, the world was not yet watching closely enough to understand what that meant. The men who had spent their working lives enforcing order through humiliation and fear, who had learned authority not from military tradition, but from the absolute power of the watchtower and the wire, were now being asked to become something the German state needed urgently: combat troops. Heinrich Himmler had made his intentions clear. The SS Totenkopf would not remain a collection of internal security formations forever. It would fight. It would bleed on open ground. It would prove, to those who doubted it most loudly, that ideological conviction could be forged into military effectiveness. Whether the raw material he possessed could actually achieve that transformation was a question no one in the SS leadership was prepared to ask out loud. Theodor Eike drove the process with the same relentless energy he had brought to the camp system. He had built the concentration camp network into a coherent bureaucratic instrument of terror, and he intended to build his division with the same methodical ferocity. From the autumn of 1939 onward, training camps filled with men who were simultaneously being re-educated about what they were and what they were expected to become. The physical standards were demanding by any measure: long marches in full kit, obstacle courses, weapons drills repeated until the movements became reflexive. But the ideological component ran parallel to every physical exercise. Eike believed, with a conviction that was more religious than military in character, that hatred properly directed was a tactical asset. A soldier who understood why he was fighting, who believed the cause was existential, would endure more, push harder, and die more willingly than a conscript soldier motivated only by orders. Whether or not that belief was correct, it shaped every aspect of how the Totenkopf trained. The men arriving into the division in this period came from varied backgrounds, though the ideological filter Himmler had established meant they shared certain characteristics. They were, almost without exception, committed to National Socialist ideology in a way that went beyond passive acceptance. Many had sought out the SS rather than waited to be conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Some were veterans of the camp guard system who carried with them the habits of authority that those postings had instilled. Others were younger men drawn by the prestige of the black uniform and the promise of belonging to an elite. What united them was not yet military experience. Most had very little, but a shared framework of belief that Ike and his cadre of instructors worked to turn into something tactically useful. The question was whether belief alone could substitute for the accumulated professional knowledge that the Wehrmacht's officer corps had spent decades building. The Wehrmacht, watching from a distance that was equal parts institutional and contemptuous, had already formed its opinion. Regular army officers regarded the Totenkopf with something close to open disdain. The word used repeatedly in Wehrmacht correspondence from this period was political, a label that carried with it an entire architecture of dismissal. These were political soldiers, the army's professionals said, not real ones. They had not come up through the proper channels. They had not studied at legitimate military academies. Their senior officers had earned their rank through loyalty to a party, rather than through demonstrated competence in the field. The Wehrmacht had centuries of institutional memory about what made armies function, and it did not believe that fanaticism was a substitute for fire discipline, logistics management, or the ability to read ground. The contempt was real, and it was widely shared, and in the early months of the division's existence, it was not entirely without foundation. Ike knew the contempt existed, and it enraged him. He was not a man who processed criticism by quietly resolving to improve. He processed it by treating every source of doubt as an enemy to be defeated, and he transferred that attitude to his men. The division developed a siege mentality early, a sense that it existed against a backdrop of institutional hostility that it would only overcome by performing so spectacularly on the battlefield that silence would be the Wehrmacht's only possible response. This was, in a strange way, motivating. It created internal cohesion, a bond formed partly from shared grievance, the feeling that outsiders looked down on them and would be proven catastrophically wrong. It also created a culture in which criticism from outside the division was dismissed rather than absorbed, which would have consequences when tactical mistakes needed to be acknowledged and corrected. The acquisition of heavy weapons was one of the clearest signals that the Totenkopf was being prepared for something larger than internal policing. In the year before the Western Campaign, the division received artillery pieces, anti-tank guns, and the early components of what would eventually become a serious armored capability. For men who had previously been armed primarily for crowd control and perimeter security, handling heavy weapons required an entirely different form of technical education. Specialist instructors cycled through the training formations. Men were sent on courses to learn how to coordinate fire, how to range targets, how to maintain complex mechanical systems under field conditions. The learning curve was steep, and the errors made during training were sometimes costly in themselves. But the process did produce a gradual accumulation of competence, and by early 1940, the Totenkopf was, at minimum, a formation that looked on paper like a proper military division. The internal culture that emerged during this period was unlike anything in the conventional military. It was not, strictly speaking, a military culture at all. It was a hybrid that had taken the external structures of military organization and fused them with the ideological intensity of a political movement. Ranks existed and were respected, but the relationship between officers and men was shaped by Ike's own belief that SS officers were brothers in arms rather than a caste apart. He despised what he called the aristocratic distance of the Wehrmacht officer corps, the way regular army officers held themselves above their men in social terms. Ike wanted his officers visible at the front, sharing hardship, leading from positions of personal danger rather than from command posts safely behind the line. This was, in many ways, genuinely admirable. It built intense loyalty between junior soldiers and their immediate leaders. It also, eventually, produced a catastrophic loss rate among junior officers and NCOs, who led from positions of exposure they could not afford. Discipline inside the division was paradoxical in character. On one hand, infractions were punished with a severity that reflected the camp system from which the organization had grown. The tolerance for weakness or dissent was essentially zero. On the other hand, the ideological framing of the unit's identity meant that soldiers were encouraged to understand themselves as warriors of a movement rather than servants of a state, which produced a form of self-directed motivation that conventional military discipline rarely achieved. Men did not simply follow orders because they feared punishment. They followed orders because they believed, deeply and genuinely, that the orders were expressions of a larger purpose they had personally chosen to serve. That combination, fear of punishment alongside genuine ideological commitment, created a formation that was in some ways more cohesive than its critics were prepared to acknowledge. Weapons training revealed something important about the gap between the division's self-image and its actual readiness. The men were capable of individual bravery in controlled exercises, but the complex coordination required by modern combined arms warfare, the synchronization of infantry movement with artillery support, the timing of attacks to exploit moments of enemy vulnerability, was something that could not be absorbed quickly. Military proficiency of that order was built through years of institutional experience, through after-action analysis, through the slow accumulation of hard lessons across multiple campaigns. The Totenkopf did not have that history. What it had instead was intensity, and intensity could carry a formation a certain distance before the limits of technical preparation became visible. By the early months of 1940, the division existed in an unusual state. It was more prepared than it had been a year earlier, genuinely transformed from a collection of camp guard units into something that resembled a functioning military formation. It had artillery and anti-tank capability. It had officers who had at least been through the theoretical study of tactics, even if they lacked combat experience. Its men were physically hardened, ideologically committed, and aware that the moment they had been preparing for was approaching. At the same time, the Wehrmacht's institutional skepticism had not been dissolved by any of this preparation. It had simply been set aside in the face of operational necessity. The German army needed manpower for what was coming. The Totenkopf would fill a slot in the order of battle, regardless of whether the professionals approved. What the formation carried into its first real campaign was therefore a mixture of genuine capability and serious unresolved weakness. The capability was real: cohesion, motivation, a willingness to absorb punishment that would have broken less committed troops. The weakness was equally real: limited tactical sophistication, an officer culture that prized personal exposure over operational caution, and a habit of treating criticism from outside as evidence of the enemy's ignorance rather than as information worth incorporating. These qualities would not become fully visible until the division was tested under fire, and the test, when it came in the forests and fields of France, would be severe enough to reveal everything, both what Eike had successfully built and what the camp system had instilled in his men that no training exercise could ever have measured or corrected. They had spent months being told they were warriors. They had drilled, marched, absorbed the language of sacrifice and racial destiny, and listened to Theodor Eike remind them again and again that softness was a form of treason. Now, in the spring of 1940, the Totenkopf Division finally had its war. Germany had launched its Great Western Offensive on the 10th of May 1940, and the Wehrmacht's armored columns were tearing through Belgium and the Netherlands with a speed that stunned the world. The Totenkopf did not lead that charge. It followed, slotted into Army Group B's order of battle as a motorized infantry division, and for the first critical days of the campaign, it moved through territory that had already been broken open by others. To men who believed themselves an elite, that was a humiliation with its own particular sting. The division crossed into the Netherlands and pushed southwest through Belgium in the wake of faster-moving armored formations. The roads were choked, columns of refugees moving in one direction, supply trucks grinding in the other, the air overhead crisscrossed by aircraft. For soldiers who had rehearsed their ideology in the controlled environment of the camp system, the reality of a collapsing country was something no amount of ideological training had quite prepared them for. Eike drove his men hard, pressing them forward with the urgency of someone determined to catch the battle before it ended without him. The early fighting was fragmentary, skirmishes at crossroads, brief artillery exchanges, the sudden crack of a sniper round from a farmhouse window. Casualties were light at first, and the pace of advance gave everything the feeling of a rehearsal rather than a war. But the campaign was already compressing toward its defining crisis. By the third week of May, the situation around the Dunkirk perimeter was forming. British and French forces were being pushed back toward the coast, fighting rearguard actions to buy time for the evacuation that would become known as Operation Dynamo. The Totenkopf Division was redirected south and west, part of the broader effort to tighten the ring around the Allied forces still on French soil. It was in this phase of the campaign, as the German advance pushed through the flat farmland and hedged lanes of northern France, that the division began to encounter something it had not expected: fierce, disciplined resistance from British troops who had no intention of simply stepping aside. Units of the British Expeditionary Force were retreating, yes, but they were fighting as they went, and some of those fights were brutal. The Totenkopf suffered meaningful losses during these engagements. Men who had swaggered through Belgium died in ditches outside unremarkable French villages. Junior officers who had been told the British were a decadent, exhausted enemy found that the men across the hedgerow shot back with precision and held their ground longer than anyone had anticipated. Eike's response to resistance, true to everything the concentration camp years had built in him, was to escalate: more pressure, more aggression, an unwillingness to accept delay or setback. The division's internal culture, forged in a system where mercy had been a form of weakness and prisoners were not quite human, was beginning to express itself in ways that went beyond tactical decisions. This was not simply aggression in battle. It was something operating under a different set of rules entirely. The town of Les Paradis sits in the Pas de Calais, a quiet stretch of northern French countryside that in late May of 1940 became the location of one of the most deliberate atrocities committed by German forces in the Western Campaign. Soldiers of the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Norfolks had been fighting a determined rearguard action, holding positions against Totenkopf forces as part of the broader British effort to slow the German advance toward the coast. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on ammunition. After hours of fighting that inflicted real casualties on the attacking SS troops, the surviving members of the unit made the decision that the laws of war entitled them to make. They surrendered. They laid down their arms. They raised what they could to signal their intention. By any framework of military conduct, that act should have ended the fighting for them. What followed instead was the 27th of May, 1940. The British prisoners, numbering close to 100 men, were marched to a barn and lined up against a wall. Then machine guns opened fire. The soldiers were cut down. Those who did not die immediately were finished individually. The men who carried this out were soldiers of the Totenkopf Division, acting under the command of an officer whose name would eventually be established through post-war investigation. The act was not a moment of chaos in the heat of combat, not a breakdown in the fog of battle. It was organized. It was methodical. It was carried out after the prisoners had surrendered and been disarmed, and it bore the unmistakable imprint of a formation whose culture treated certain categories of human being as existing outside the protection of any law. 2 men survived. Badly wounded, they lay beneath the bodies of their comrades through the night and into the following day, eventually crawling to a farmhouse where a French family hid them at tremendous personal risk. Those 2 survivors would become the foundation on which post-war justice would eventually attempt to stand. Their accounts, given in the chaos of the immediate post-war period, and then refined through formal testimony, were specific and consistent. They remembered, and because they remembered, the act could not simply dissolve into the general violence of the war and disappear. The massacre at Le Paradis entered the record, and the record would wait. Within the division, the killings at Le Paradis were not an aberration that caused shock or recrimination. There was no documented internal outcry, no officer demanding accountability, no signal sent up the chain of command acknowledging that something had gone wrong. What had happened was, in the logic of the Totenkopf's culture, entirely consonant with everything Eike had built. The men under his command had been conditioned for years in an environment where the people in their custody were enemies of the state, where violence was a management tool, and where the ordinary moral restraints governing the treatment of prisoners had been systematically dismantled. Le Paradis was not a departure from that culture. It was its direct application in a new setting. The broader campaign continued. France fell with a speed that astonished even those who had planned the offensive. On the 22nd of June 1940, France signed an armistice. German forces stood at the English Channel, and across the Reich there was celebration, a sense that the war in the West was essentially over. For the Totenkopf Division, the remaining weeks in France were occupation duties, the strange, uncomfortable transition from moving through a breaking country to standing still inside a defeated one. There were parades and photographs, letters home, the rituals of soldiers who believed they had won something decisive. Eike wrote to Himmler with satisfaction. The division had proven itself in combat. The doubts that the Wehrmacht had expressed, the open contempt of the professional soldiers who had called his men poorly trained political thugs, had been answered, or so he believed. But the Wehrmacht's contempt had not actually dissipated. It had simply been redirected. Regular army officers who learned of what had happened at Le Paradis were not impressed by the division's fighting record. They were appalled and alarmed, and some of them said so through internal channels. The tension between the Totenkopf and the professional military establishment was not resolved by the French campaign. It was deepened, given new and more troubling texture. Here was a formation that had committed a war crime in its first serious engagement, that had murdered men who had surrendered under the conventions both sides were nominally bound by, and whose commander showed no indication that he considered this a problem. The Wehrmacht's unease would continue to simmer, though it never translated into meaningful accountability. Not yet. The summer and autumn of 1940 passed in relative quiet for the division. There were exercises, reorganizations, the ordinary rhythms of an army waiting to find out what it would be ordered to do next. Replacements arrived to fill the gaps left by casualties. New equipment was distributed and maintained, but underneath the administrative normalcy, the Le Paradis killings sat like something sealed inside a wall, invisible on the surface, present nonetheless. For the 2 men who had survived by lying still beneath their dead comrades, the war was not over. It would never be entirely over. They carried what they had witnessed, and the names and unit designations they had noted were already the beginning of a case that the chaos of an ongoing war would delay but not prevent. The officers and men of the Totenkopf Division moved through their comfortable occupation billets in France, ate their meals, polished their boots, and prepared for whatever came next. Somewhere across the channel, survivors were giving statements. The reckoning existed. It was simply waiting for the war to end. What the division took away from France was a belief in its own effectiveness and a culture of impunity that the campaign had done nothing to disturb. It had fought. It had advanced. It had, by some measures, performed well enough to silence the most dismissive critics inside the German military establishment, and it had committed a mass execution of prisoners and suffered no consequences whatsoever. That absence of consequence was itself a lesson, absorbed without being articulated, carried forward into the next campaign and the one after that. The Eastern Front was coming, and on the Eastern Front, the violence that had produced Le Paradis would not be an exceptional incident at odds with official policy. It would be policy. The Death's Head formation had passed its first test of war. What it had revealed about itself in doing so would take years, and the testimony of the men it failed to kill to fully reckon with. By the summer of 1940, the men of the Totenkopf Division had crossed something. Not just a border or a riverline, but a threshold in their own understanding of what they were and what they were capable of. They had fought in France, had taken losses they had not expected, and had committed acts that the laws of war had already, clearly, forbidden. Now they came back. The guns went quiet, at least for them. The division was pulled westward, away from the front lines, and given something soldiers rarely receive cleanly and completely: time. Time to rest, to grieve quietly, to refit, and to prepare. But in the world of the SS, time was never merely time. It was always something to be filled with purpose, with instruction, with the steady pressure of an ideology that never rested, even when its soldiers did. The division settled into garrison existence across occupied France and the Low Countries, billeted in towns and farms that still carried the smell of a war that had only just ended. For the men who had survived the drive through the West, there was an odd dislocation to it. They slept in beds, they ate regularly, they walked streets that were not being shelled. But the machinery of the organization continued turning around them regardless of the quiet, and Theodor Eicke was not a man built for stillness. He had spent years in the concentration camp system, driving men and systems forward through force of personality and institutional brutality, and he brought exactly that energy to the work of rebuilding. Reports, inspections, training schedules, equipment requisitions. He pushed all of it simultaneously, with the relentless forward pressure of a man who understood that the war was not over, but merely paused. What Eicke understood, and what the senior SS leadership confirmed to him through the latter months of 1940 and into 1941, was that the Totenkopf Division was going to fight again, and soon. The shape of that coming war was not yet fully defined in the men's daily orders, but its outline was legible to anyone paying attention to the movements of German strategy. Adolf Hitler had already set his mind eastward. The non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union had always been, in his framing, a temporary convenience, a pause between two inevitable confrontations. For Himmler and Eicke, whose worldview was saturated with a particular brand of racial and ideological obsession, the coming campaign against the Soviet Union was not simply a military operation. It was a crusade, framed in terms so extreme that to repeat them is to understand why the conduct on the Eastern Front would eventually reach a scale of horror that even the West had not seen. The men were told, repeatedly and in formal settings, that they were preparing not for a conventional war, but for a struggle of extermination against an ideological enemy that had no right to the same treatment as soldiers in the West. Against that backdrop, the practical work of rebuilding the division proceeded on a considerable scale. The Totenkopf had come out of France significantly under strength. Its casualties had not been catastrophic in the way the Eastern Front would later define that word, but they had been real. Officers dead, vehicles destroyed, weapons worn out or lost. The rebuilding process addressed all of this, but it went much further than simple replacement. New men arrived in substantial numbers, drawn from a variety of sources. Some came from the SS reserve formations that had been expanding throughout the occupation. Others were transfers from other branches of the SS apparatus, men with varying degrees of military training. A smaller number were volunteers in the more traditional sense, young Germans caught up in the momentum of apparent victory, drawn toward the SS by its prestige, its propaganda, its carefully cultivated image of elite belonging. Whatever their origin, they arrived into a unit that had a distinct culture already formed, and that culture absorbed them deliberately and systematically. The training regime that Eike imposed on these new men was neither gentle nor ambiguous. He had always believed that soldiers were made through hardship, through the deliberate stripping away of softness, and his methods reflected that conviction at every level. Physical training was relentless. Weapons drills were conducted until they became reflex rather than thought. Small unit tactics were rehearsed across the kinds of terrain the planners anticipated in the East. Open ground, dense forest, river crossings in conditions that were meant to replicate the challenges of a vast and poorly mapped country. Experienced NCOs who had fought in France were given an explicit role in the education of the newcomers, not simply in tactics, but in the division's particular identity, its mythology of toughness, its specific pride that set it apart from the Wehrmacht units that still regarded Eike's men with varying degrees of disdain. That contempt from the regular army had stung, and within the division, it had been transformed into a source of motivation, a determination to prove, in the next campaign, whatever the Wehrmacht thought it knew about soldiering. The equipment situation improved substantially across this period. The division received additional artillery, heavier anti-tank weapons, and a more complete complement of supporting arms that had been lacking or thinly distributed during the French campaign. The logistical tail was reorganized, a recognition that the supply failures of France, where columns had struggled to keep pace with a fast-moving advance, would be far more costly in a theater the size of the Soviet Union. Engineers were integrated more thoughtfully into the divisional structure. Communications equipment was upgraded, and the training on it intensified, because anyone with experience of modern warfare understood that a formation that could not communicate coherently was a formation that could not survive. All of these changes reflected a genuine attempt to transform what had been, entering France, a partially trained ideological militia, into something approaching a credible modern military division. What did not change, and was never meant to change, was the ideological core. Himmler visited the division during this period, as he visited SS formations regularly, and his addresses to the assembled men were the opposite of conventional military instruction. He spoke of the war to come in terms drawn from a racial worldview so extreme that its full content still requires careful handling by historians today. The Soviet state, as he described it, was not a legitimate government, but an apparatus of racial enemies. The people they would encounter, he told the men, were subhuman in the specific vocabulary of the regime's own ideology, a word that, once absorbed, was designed to dissolve the normal inhibitions that prevent soldiers from committing atrocities. Eike reinforced these messages in his own communications, in his orders, in the informal culture he cultivated among his officers. The men of the Totenkopf were being prepared not merely to fight, but to fight in a particular way, governed by a particular set of permissions that no laws of war recognized. Among the junior ranks, this preparation produced a complex internal atmosphere that would have been difficult to read from the outside. Some men were fully committed ideological believers who needed no additional persuasion. Others were soldiers first, who absorbed the political content as background noise behind the more immediate concerns of training and preparation. Others still were new enough to military life that the division's culture was simply the world they inhabited, its assumptions taken in along with everything else. What most shared, regardless of their degree of ideological commitment, was a sense of mounting anticipation. They knew something large was coming. The scale of the preparations around them, the movements of other formations, the speeches from senior leaders who did not disguise the direction of German ambition, all of it pointed east, and pointed there with increasing clarity as the months moved from autumn into winter, and from winter towards spring. The Totenkopf's relationship with the Wehrmacht during this waiting period remained complicated. The friction that had marked the French campaign did not simply dissolve because the two forces were nominally on the same side. Regular army officers continued to regard the SS divisions with a mixture of professional skepticism and institutional wariness. The SS formations sat outside the normal Wehrmacht chain of command in important ways, reported to different authorities, operated under different legal frameworks, and were associated in the minds of many conventional officers with the kind of conduct that professional soldiers preferred to believe they stood apart from. Eike, for his part, was not interested in managing this relationship diplomatically. He competed rather than cooperated, pressed for resources, argued for the independent operational role of his division, and communicated to his men that what the army thought of them was irrelevant, that performance under fire was the only measure that mattered. By the late spring of 1941, the waiting was nearly over. The division had been moved eastward, closer to the Soviet border, as the concentration of German forces in the east reached a scale that could no longer be concealed or plausibly explained. The men knew, the officers knew. Everyone from Eike downward understood that the long rest and the long rebuilding had been preparation for something the leadership considered the defining campaign of the war. The ideological framing gave it a quality beyond normal military anticipation. This was not simply another country to be defeated, but a world to be transformed, an enemy to be destroyed in terms that went well beyond the battlefield. For men who had been told all of this repeatedly, in formal addresses and in daily unit culture, the weight of what lay ahead had a particular character, something between purpose and dread, between absolute conviction and the quiet knowledge, shared among those who had already fought, that the East would not be France. When the division finally crossed into Soviet territory in the summer of 1941, it went forward as a genuinely different formation from the one that had entered France 12 months before. Larger, better armed, more coherently organized, more tactically sophisticated, in at least the formal sense of training completed and equipment acquired. The waiting year had done what waiting years are meant to do. It had rebuilt a division that had been worn down and partially exposed by its first real test, and it had pointed that division toward a new theater, with all the institutional force the SS could bring to bear. What it had not done, and what no amount of training ever could do, was prepare the men for what the Soviet Union would actually be. The distances, the resistance, the winter, the sheer relentless weight of a war fought at a scale that France had never approached, and that nothing in their experience had truly equipped them to understand. That understanding was still ahead of them, waiting in the mud and cold of a country that would test every calculation the Totenkopf's commanders had made during their long and carefully managed year of preparation. In the early hours of the 22nd of June, 1941, the longest land border in the history of modern warfare erupted. Across a front stretching from the Baltic coast to the Black Sea, more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed into Soviet territory simultaneously, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft in the largest single military operation ever mounted. The men of the Totenkopf Division had spent months preparing for this moment, their commanders framing the coming campaign not as a conventional war between states, but as a racial and ideological crusade against what Himmler called the biological enemy of the German people. They had been told it would be swift. They had been told it would be decisive, a matter of weeks, perhaps months, before the Soviet system buckled under the weight of German arms and the supposed inferiority of its leadership. The reality waiting beyond that border would demand a brutal and catastrophic revision of every one of those assumptions. The men who crossed into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 were, in many respects, still the force shaped by Theodor Eicker's camp guard culture, hard, ideologically primed, and dangerously confident. They were about to discover what war looked like when the enemy did not intend to stop fighting. The Totenkopf Division crossed into Soviet-held territory as part of Army Group North, the northern prong of a three-part advance aimed at Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev respectively. Army Group North's axis of advance carried it through the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, territories only recently absorbed into the Soviet sphere, and whose populations greeted German soldiers in places with a wariness that ranged from cautious observation to outright collaboration, depending on local circumstance. For the Totenkopf, the initial advance had a quality of terrible momentum. Roads and fields blurred past in the summer heat, columns of vehicles raising clouds of pale dust that could be seen from kilometers away. The Soviet formations in these early days were often caught badly positioned, their communications severed by German air attacks, their commanders paralyzed by the shock of the assault and by the catastrophic rigidity of orders flowing from Moscow that forbade retreat and punished initiative. In these early miles, the campaign seemed to echo the swift collapse of France. Speed felt like destiny. It was not. What the Totenkopf encountered almost immediately, and with a violence that startled even veterans of the Western campaign, was the sheer refusal of Soviet soldiers to behave as expected. In France, encirclement had reliably produced surrender. Here, encircled Soviet units continued fighting long past the point where any military logic would have demanded capitulation. Individual soldiers and small units fought on from forests and marshes, from destroyed villages and collapsed farmhouses, from positions already overrun and supposedly cleared. The division began suffering casualties in the very first days that had no equivalent in the French campaign, not because the Soviet forces opposing them were better equipped or better coordinated, but because they simply would not stop. German soldiers began to speak of this with something between frustration and a creeping unease. What had been promised as a short, decisive war was showing its other face within the first week. The ideological preparation the division had received shaped its response to this resistance in ways that would define its conduct across the entire Eastern Front. The orders governing the campaign were unlike anything issued for the war in the West. The Commissar order, issued before Barbarossa began, directed that Soviet political officers captured in the field were to be shot rather than treated as prisoners of war. Alongside this came broader instructions that deliberately blurred the line between combatants and civilians, framing the Soviet population as collectively suspect, as carriers of an ideological contagion that justified measures no Geneva Convention would have recognized. For a division already steeped in the logic of the camp system, a logic that dehumanized its subjects by category rather than by individual action, these orders mapped perfectly onto an existing worldview. The Totenkopf did not receive these instructions as a shocking novelty. For many of its officers and NCOs, they felt like official confirmation of what they had always believed. The pace of the advance through the Baltic states in late June and early July was at times exhilarating and at times grinding, often both within the same 24 hours. The division moved in the shadow of faster mechanized formations, frequently tasked with securing flanks, mopping up bypassed resistance, and keeping open the supply corridors on which the entire advance depended. This was not the glamorous spearhead role, and Iker chafed at it constantly, pushing his men forward, demanding speed from units already exhausted by heat and distance. Supply was already becoming a problem. The roads of the Soviet Union were not roads in any sense the division's logistics planners had fully anticipated. In dry weather, they were rutted tracks of compressed earth that reduced vehicle columns to crawling speed. In rain, they became something close to rivers of mud. Equipment broke down faster than it could be repaired. Ammunition and fuel arrived erratically. The vast distances between objectives that had looked manageable on maps in Germany felt entirely different when measured in days of marching and driving under a summer sun. The human cost began mounting in ways the division's commanders had not prepared their men to absorb. The losses among junior officers and sergeants, the men who led platoons and sections in close contact with the enemy, were disproportionate and deeply damaging. These were the experienced NCOs who had survived the training period, some of whom had been with Iker since the early days of the camp guard formations. Their replacements were younger, less experienced, and inherited positions of responsibility, far beyond what their training had equipped them to handle. The division was bleeding institutional knowledge, alongside blood. Each action that erased a sergeant or a platoon commander took something that could not simply be replaced with fresh bodies and new equipment, no matter how many reinforcements arrived from the rear. There were moments in those early weeks when the fluidity of the advance produced scenes of almost disorienting scale. Columns of Soviet prisoners, thousands and then tens of thousands of men, moved westward past the advancing German lines, guarded by small detachments, shuffling through the dust in a state of physical collapse. The division's treatment of these prisoners was governed by the same ideological framework that had shaped its orders from the start. Conditions in improvised holding areas were brutal by any standard of military law. Food, water, and medical attention were either withheld or provided in quantities so inadequate they amounted to the same thing. Soviet prisoners in German hands on the Eastern Front died in enormous numbers in the first months of Barbarossa, and the Totenkopf was not distinct from the broader pattern. It was, in many respects, one of its practitioners. By the time the advance reached the approaches to the Luga River in mid-July of 1941, the division had been fighting and moving almost continuously for nearly a month. Its strength was substantially reduced from the force that had crossed the border. The easy kilometers were behind them. Ahead lay something different, a Soviet defensive line that had been prepared with more care than the improvised resistance encountered in the opening days, manned by units that had had time to dig in, to sight their weapons, and to wait. The fluid warfare of the Baltic advance was ending. The Totenkopf was about to slam into something immovable, and neither Iker's ferocity nor his men's ideological conviction would serve as a substitute for the tactical preparation and material resources they increasingly lacked. It is worth pausing here to register what the division had learned, or failed to learn, in its first weeks in the Soviet Union. The French campaign had taught its officers and men a version of modern warfare that was essentially confirmatory. It confirmed the ideology, confirmed the superiority of the German soldier, confirmed that the war would be won quickly by the simply determined and the ideologically pure. The first weeks of Barbarossa were teaching a different lesson, one that some men were absorbing and many were not. The Soviet Union was not France. Its geography was not France. Its army was not the army of France. Above all, the Soviet soldier, whatever his commander's failures, was not a man who measured his resistance against the odds in any way that the German command or the Totenkopf Division had fully accounted for. The division's crossing into Soviet territory had been celebrated in the language of ideological mission. Eicke communicated to his men that what they were doing was not merely fighting a war, but cleansing a threat to the existence of the German people. That framing made atrocities easier to commit and harder to question. It also made military failure harder to acknowledge. When Soviet resistance proved fiercer than predicted, the ideological explanation was ready. The enemy was subhuman and therefore unpredictable, fanatical in the way of the racially degenerate, rather than brave in any sense that deserved respect. This framework insulated the division's leadership from the more uncomfortable recognition that their planning had been wrong and their assumptions catastrophically flawed. It would cost them, and it would cost their men, in ways that would grow larger with every passing month on the Eastern Front. What remained, as the summer of 1941 turned toward the hard fighting at the Luga line, was a division that had covered enormous distances, suffered significant losses, and committed acts that placed it beyond any claim of ordinary soldiering. The skull and crossbones insignia the men wore had not been chosen arbitrarily. It had been chosen because Himmler and Eicke understood exactly what kind of force they were building, and exactly what they intended it to do. The soldiers of the Totenkopf Division were not simply fighting a war in the Soviet Union. They were participating in something for which the word war is only partially adequate. A campaign of deliberate destruction in which military objectives and ideological crimes were not separate categories, but a single, inseparable enterprise. The weeks ahead at the Luga River would test them in ways that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with the simple, grinding arithmetic of modern attrition. And they would find, for the first time, that fanaticism alone is not enough to hold a line. The advance had felt, in those first weeks, almost like a continuation of the Western campaign. Roads eaten up in long columns, dust rising over the Baltic plains, the sense that speed itself was a weapon. But by late July of 1941, that feeling was gone. The Totenkopf Division had pushed deep into Soviet territory as part of Army Group North's drive toward Leningrad, and now it found itself pressing against the Luga River, a natural defensive barrier the Soviets had chosen to make their stand. What waited on the far bank was not the disorganized, crumbling resistance the men had encountered in the opening days of Barbarossa. It was something harder, colder, and far more willing to absorb punishment than anything the division had faced in France. The river itself was not wide, but width was never the point. The point was what the Soviets had built along it: layered defensive positions, concealed artillery, and a determination to hold that caught the Germans completely off guard. The terrain surrounding the Luga River did as much damage to the Totenkopf as any Soviet rifleman. The forests here were dense and trackless, the ground beneath them soft and waterlogged even in summer. Vehicles that had rolled freely across the roads of France now bogged down on paths that dissolved under repeated use. Supply columns fell hours behind schedule, then a full day behind, then further still. Ammunition, fuel, and food moved forward at a fraction of the rate the advance demanded. The men at the front were consuming supplies faster than they could be replaced. And the further the division pushed into the forests along the Luga, the worse the problem became. Engineers who might have been building crossing points were instead wrestling supply trucks out of the mud. It was a logistical crisis, disguised as a tactical one, and it would only deepen. Theodor Eicke reacted to the slowdown the way he had always reacted to resistance. He pushed harder. His leadership style had never been shaped by the Wehrmacht's tradition of operational patience, the careful reading of terrain, the measured husbanding of resources. Eicke had built his reputation in the camp system on the application of relentless pressure, on the belief that will could substitute for circumstance. Now, with his divisions stalling in front of Soviet positions along the river, he ordered attack after attack rather than consolidating and waiting for conditions to improve. He drove his regimental commanders forward at a pace that left them little time to reconnoiter ground or prepare properly. When attacks failed, he demanded to know why, and the answers he received: enemy strength, inadequate artillery support, supply shortfalls, he treated as excuses rather than reasons. The men under him paid for this approach in blood. The Soviet defenders along the Luga were fighting with an intensity that had no precedent in the Western campaign. In France, encirclement often produced surrender. Here, it produced something else entirely: fighting from positions already overrun, counterattacks from units that by any conventional measure should have ceased to exist, soldiers who held bunkers without relief or resupply until they were physically silenced. German troops who had internalized the idea that the Soviet soldier was an inferior adversary encountered the reality and found it did not match the theory. Morale among the Totenkopf's veteran NCOs held, but the shock was visible. Letters written home during this period, examined after the war, record men struggling to articulate an enemy that simply would not behave as expected. One repeated theme was exhaustion, not just physical, but something that came from fighting against resistance that had no obvious limit. The losses among junior officers and non-commissioned officers were catastrophic and, crucially, irreplaceable in any immediate sense. These were the men who held the division together at the level where doctrine meets ground: the platoon commanders, the squad leaders, the experienced sergeants who knew how to keep men moving under fire. In the fluid, fast-moving warfare of the opening weeks of Barbarossa, their skills had been an advantage. Now, in the grinding, attritional fighting along the Luga, they were being expended faster than the division could absorb. A regiment that attacked a Soviet position in the morning, with its established leadership structure, might find itself, by afternoon, running on improvisation. Younger men, some barely out of training, were stepping into roles for which nothing had prepared them. Some rose to the occasion. Many did not survive long enough to find out whether they could. Eicke, for his part, was everywhere. He moved between forward positions in a way that his own staff found alarming, appearing at the front in his command vehicle when the tactical situation was least secure. There was something genuine in this. He was not a man who led from comfort, but there was also something that the more experienced military minds around him recognized as recklessness. He was a divisional commander, exposing himself like a battalion officer, and the men who served under him were in the paradoxical position of admiring the courage while dreading the consequences. Wehrmacht liaison officers who observed him during this period reported his methods with a mixture of disbelief and professional disapproval. The German army had its own cult of the forward commander, but it drew distinctions between physical presence and operational exposure that Eicke simply did not make. By August of 1941, the Totenkopf Division's assault capacity had been severely degraded. Units that had crossed into Soviet territory weeks earlier at something close to established strength were now shadows of themselves. The division's infantry regiments which had gone into Barbarossa as the core offensive instrument, were thinned to the point where they struggled to mount coherent attacks against prepared positions. Artillery support, never lavish, had become intermittent as shells moved forward in inadequate quantities through the failing supply network. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, with wounded men waiting longer for treatment than the division's pre-war planning had ever anticipated. The contrast with France, where the campaign had lasted barely 6 weeks from start to surrender, was not lost on anyone. This was already longer, and Leningrad was still not in sight. The Soviets did not simply hold the Luga line, they pushed back against it. Counterattacks, some of them substantial in size, probed the Totenkopf's positions along the river with regularity. These attacks varied enormously in quality. Some were well coordinated and dangerous, others poorly organized and beaten off with comparative ease. But their cumulative effect was to deny the division any period of genuine rest or consolidation. Every night brought the possibility of another assault. Every morning began with the requirement to verify that the positions held during the night had not been infiltrated or lost. The psychological weight of this constant pressure, layered on top of the physical attrition, began to produce something the division's commanders had not had to manage before. Men who were genuinely running out of whatever reservoir they had drawn on to keep moving. Supply failures compounded every tactical problem. In France, the Wehrmacht's logistical chain had functioned well enough that shortages were inconveniences rather than crises. In the forests and mud of the Luga region, they were operational emergencies. Fuel for armored vehicles ran short at moments when armored support would have changed the outcome of an engagement. Artillery ammunition arrived in quantities that forced battery commanders to ration shells during active firefights. Food deliveries became inconsistent, and men who were burning extraordinary energy in hard physical fighting went without adequate rations for days at a stretch. The horses used to move supplies through terrain impassable. Trucks were dying faster than they could be requisitioned. The entire logistical architecture that Army Group North had designed for a fast, conclusive drive to Leningrad was straining under conditions it had not been built to survive. Among the rank and file, the weeks along the Luga produced the first real questioning of what kind of war this was going to be. The men of the Totenkopf had entered the Soviet Union saturated with ideology. The campaign had been framed to them not merely as a military operation, but as a war of annihilation against a racial and political enemy. Ika had delivered these messages with his characteristic forcefulness. But ideology did not help when the mud sucked the boots from your feet. When the man beside you had been killed by a counterattack from a unit you thought was already destroyed. When the river in front of you had not moved closer in a week, despite everything you had given to move it. What the Luga fighting produced, in place of the ideological clarity of the division's pre-war culture, was a grimmer and more practical understanding that this enemy would not break the way Western enemies had broken, and that the cost of continuing would be measured in a currency the division had not yet learned to spend wisely. When German command eventually reorganized the approach along the northern axis, and the immediate pressure on the Luga line shifted, the Totenkopf Division had been changed by what it had endured. It had not been destroyed. Its core of experienced soldiers and its command structure remained intact, but it had been fundamentally altered. The reckless confidence of the early weeks, the assumption that movement and aggression would always find a way through, had been replaced by something harder and more cautious. The losses of junior leaders had forced rapid, brutal improvisation that left scars on the unit's institutional knowledge. Ika remained in command, unbowed in his public manner, but privately aware, according to those close to him, that the Eastern War operated by different rules than anything he had previously encountered. The Luga River had not stopped the Totenkopf permanently, but it had given the division its first encounter with the particular arithmetic of the Eastern Front, where the numbers never quite added up in the attacker's favor, and where the mud, the trees, and the enemy's refusal to accept defeat combined to drain even the most fanatical formation of its certainty that will alone could determine the outcome. By late autumn of 1941, the grand vision of Operation Barbarossa lay in ruins. The Wehrmacht had failed to achieve knockout victory before winter. German forces were strung out across vast territories, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, exhausted, undersupplied, and facing an enemy that grew stronger with each passing week. The Totenkopf Division, already battered from months of combat along the Luga River, found itself caught in a catastrophic turn of events that would test not merely its military capabilities, but the very threshold of human endurance. In early November, as snow began to fall across the Russian steppe, Soviet forces launched their own offensive. What followed was an encirclement so vast and sudden that it would trap an entire German corps, including the Totenkopf, in a pocket of frozen ground near the city of Demyansk. The division had been fighting north of the Luga for weeks, pressed into service as the spearhead of Army Group North's faltering drive toward Leningrad. The pace of operations had become murderous. Officers and NCOs fell constantly under Soviet fire. Supply convoys struggled through mud that turned impassable once the rains came. Men suffered from dysentery and exposure. The promise of a quick campaign had evaporated, replaced by the grim arithmetic of attrition. When Soviet forces broke through German lines to the south and west in the first week of November, the situation deteriorated within hours, from desperate to apocalyptic. The Totenkopf Division, along with other elements of General Adolf Strauss's Second Army, suddenly found itself isolated in a salient that jutted eastward into Soviet territory. Soviet cavalry and mechanized formations pressed inward from three directions. By the 8th of November, the pocket had closed. Roughly 90,000 German troops were trapped inside a roughly circular enclave centered on Demyansk, a town of no great significance that would become a nexus of suffering and endurance. The Totenkopf Division, weakened by months of fighting and losses, was among them. What followed tested the limits of what frozen, starving men could endure. The encirclement was not tight enough to be instantly catastrophic, but it was inescapable. German commanders faced a terrible choice: attempt an immediate breakout westward toward German lines, or entrench and defend the pocket until relief could be organized. General Strauss initially ordered a breakout, but coordinating such an operation across 90,000 men in the snow proved impossible. The attempt collapsed in chaos. Hundreds froze to death during the night. Vehicles broke down, units became separated. The breakout was abandoned, and the division grimly prepared for a siege. The Totenkopf soldiers dug in, establishing defensive positions around the perimeter of the pocket. The ground was frozen solid, making fortification nearly impossible. Men hacked at the earth with entrenching tools and explosives, working through the night in darkness and sub-zero cold. Officers and NCOs, many of them veterans of the concentration camp service, drove their men forward with a ferocity born of desperation. There was nowhere to run. The only survival lay in holding ground until relief arrived or death claimed them where they stood. The scale of the disaster became apparent with agonizing slowness as winter deepened. The pocket became a catastrophe, not because of Soviet assault, though that came in waves, but because of something far more primal: starvation and cold. German logistics, already strained across thousands of kilometers of front, could not sustain 90,000 men in an encircled position. Supply drops by air were inadequate and unpredictable. The Luftwaffe, already depleted by its own losses, promised to resupply the pocket by transport aircraft. In reality, the airlift could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. Rations were cut repeatedly. By December, men were receiving less than half the calories necessary to survive a Siberian winter while performing physical labor. Bread was rationed to less than 200 grams per man per day. Meat was almost non-existent. Officers and NCOs, who had once commanded respect through ideology and authority, now led men for whom starvation had become the dominant reality. Frostbite began its grim work. Fingers turned black and fell off. Toes rotted in boots. Men's feet froze solid despite constant movement. Medical orderlies amputated limbs with inadequate anesthesia. Hospitals, overwhelmed with the frost-burned and the starving, became repositories of the dying. Every night, more men succumbed to hypothermia. Every morning, corpses were stacked like cordwood in the snow. The Soviet forces surrounding the pocket maintained constant, grinding pressure. Unlike the German forces at Demyansk, the Soviets were fighting on lines of supply that actually worked. They had reinforcements, ammunition, and food. Their assaults came wave after wave, not with the precision of formal operations, but with the relentless momentum of a vastly larger force. Infantry attacks probed the German perimeter daily. Artillery bombardment was constant. Mortars and machine guns fired from positions that encircled the Germans completely. The fighting was brutal and close, often hand-to-hand in the snow. German soldiers, driven by fear and the knowledge that surrender to the Soviets meant either death in captivity or something worse, fought with desperate ferocity. The Totenkopf men, hardened by their backgrounds in the concentration camp system and shaped by months of Eastern Front combat, became particularly notorious for their refusal to yield ground. They held sectors of the perimeter against Soviet attacks that should have broken through. Officers reported that men fought with the kind of mechanical determination that came from having nowhere else to go, but the cost was immense. For every Soviet assault repulsed, German casualties mounted. The division's strength, already depleted from the Luga fighting, was ground down further. By January, the Totenkopf could muster only a fraction of its authorized strength. The attempts to relieve the pocket became a secondary disaster in their own right. German forces outside the encirclement launched counterattacks to break through Soviet lines and establish a corridor to Demyansk. These operations were commanded by General Walter Model and other senior commanders, who threw armor and infantry forward in repeated waves. The ground was frozen, which should have favored armored operations, but the snow was deep and the Soviet defenses were formidable. Panzer divisions drove forward, suffering devastating losses to Soviet anti-tank guns and massed artillery. Villages changed hands multiple times. German soldiers and Soviets alike died in the frozen landscape by the thousands. The relief column reached within sight of the pocket, but could not break through. German forces outside could hear the sounds of fighting from within the encirclement. Commanders reported that they could see smoke rising from Demyansk itself. Yet the gap between the relief forces and the trapped garrison remained, stubbornly, fatally impassable. Supply aircraft continued to attempt deliveries, but losses to Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire mounted. The Luftwaffe sustained casualties it could not replace. Aircraft crashed in the snow. Crews and cargo were lost. The airlift became less reliable. The pocket, while technically still supplied, was fed with starvation rations dropped from above. Winter reached its absolute nadir in January of 1942. Temperatures plunged below 40 degrees Celsius. The wind across the steppe had a quality that seemed to slice through clothing and flesh and freeze the very marrow inside bones. Men stopped trying to stay warm and instead struggled simply not to freeze to death. Cases of trench foot and frostbite multiplied exponentially. Gangrene set in. Infections became unstoppable. The division's medical personnel, themselves starving and exhausted, could do almost nothing. A soldier with frostbite did not recover within the pocket. He froze, or he succumbed to infection, or he was mercy-killed by a comrade. Officers and NCOs began to fail psychologically. The iron discipline that had held the Totenkopf together started to fracture. Some men simply sat in the snow and waited to die. Others maintained the discipline of the line through sheer will. The Totenkopf's officers, however, did not falter. They continued to rally men, drive them forward, punish surrender with execution. The culture of the division, forged in the cruelty of the concentration camp system, became a kind of strange asset. These men knew how to inflict suffering on themselves and others. They had the psychological architecture to function in a nightmare. The same ideological fanaticism that had made them capable of atrocity now sustained them as soldiers when ordinary men would have broken. By late January, the situation had become almost surreal. The Germans still held the pocket, but only barely. The division was a shadow of its authorized strength. Thousands were dead or dying. The airlift was failing. Relief had not come. Yet the Totenkopf soldiers did not surrender. Soviet commanders, astonished at the German refusal to break, launched assault after assault that were repulsed at terrible cost to both sides. German intelligence reports described Soviet divisions mauled in the fighting, thousands of Soviet casualties. But for every Soviet soldier killed, multiple Germans died from cold and starvation rather than from combat. The mathematics of the pocket were inexorable and terrible. Relief finally began to arrive in February, not in the form of a breakthrough that established a secure corridor, but in the form of steady reinforcement that allowed German forces to expand the perimeter and gradually reduce the pressure on the garrison. By mid-February, the pocket, while still technically encircled, had been enlarged sufficiently that supply could improve. The division, still trapped and still suffering, at least faced the prospect of eventual survival. German forces eventually broke through to establish a tenuous connection to the outside world. The Totenkopf Division emerged from the Demyansk pocket transformed. The men who came out were no longer recognizably the soldiers who had entered the encirclement. They were skeletal, frost-burned, hollow-eyed survivors of something that exceeded even the brutal standards of the Eastern Front. Official casualty figures listed the division as having lost more than half its combat strength. Unofficially, observers reported that the Totenkopf had lost somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 men, either killed in action, dead from wounds, or dead from starvation and exposure. Entire officer and NCO corps had been wiped out and replaced. The division was pulled back to refit and recover, but the men who had survived Demyansk carried that experience in their bones. They had endured something that shattered the psychology of ordinary soldiers. Veterans reported that after Demyansk, nothing else seemed quite real. The cold, the hunger, the constant death became the baseline for existence. When the division was rebuilt and sent back to combat, those men fought with a kind of hardened professionalism that was simultaneously admirable and terrible. They knew how to endure. They knew how to hold ground at any cost. They had learned that lesson, written in blood and ice. The Demyansk pocket became legendary within the Wehrmacht and the SS. It was cited as proof of German superiority in will and discipline. Nazi propaganda seized on the story of a trapped garrison that refused to surrender, enduring impossible conditions and holding out until relief arrived. Officers at the pocket were decorated with the Knight's Cross. The division received commendations. In this version of the story, Demyansk was a triumph of German arms and morale. But there was another version. Soviet historians, and later German historians, emphasized the needless death toll, the supply failures, the desperate waste of human life on both sides. The pocket should never have been allowed to form. Once formed, the garrison should have broken out immediately, rather than endure months of starvation and cold. The relief operations had been misconceived and executed with a kind of grim, mechanical disregard for casualties. The Totenkopf Division had played its assigned role, holding ground at any human cost, with a kind of mechanical efficiency that reflected the culture from which it had emerged. That efficiency, however, was inseparable from the ideology and brutality that defined the division. The men who held the perimeter were the same men who, weeks earlier, had engaged in the organized cruelty of the camp system. The discipline and fanaticism that kept them fighting in the frozen pocket was the same fanaticism that made them capable of worse crimes still to come. The legacy of Demyansk within the division was complex and corrosive. The men who survived had endured something that appeared to validate the Nazi narrative of German superiority. They had suffered more than human beings should be capable of suffering, and emerged psychologically intact, if scarred. But survival at Demyansk had come at the cost of an irreplaceable moral reserve. The men had learned that their leaders would drive them into hell and expect them to hold ground until they froze to death or were relieved. They had learned that starvation and suffering were acceptable prices for strategic aims. They had learned that the only value that mattered was holding ground, maintaining the perimeter, refusing to surrender. These lessons, once learned, could not be unlearned. When the Totenkopf was rebuilt and sent back to the Eastern Front, the men carried Demyansk with them. It had been their crucible. It had tested them and found them capable of enduring the most extreme conditions. But it had also solidified within them a kind of grimness, a refusal to question orders, an acceptance of suffering as the baseline condition of existence. The division that emerged from Demyansk in the winter of 1942 was not the same formation that had entered the pocket in November. It was harder, colder, and more efficient as an instrument of war. It was also, in ways that were not yet fully apparent, closer to the abyss. By the early months of 1943, the Demyansk pocket had become a graveyard of frozen mud and splintered hope. The encirclement that had begun in January showed no signs of breaking. Supply flights from the Reich struggled through Soviet fighter patrols, and weather so brutal that pilots spoke of flying blind through walls of snow. The men inside the pocket, roughly 90,000 German troops packed into a shrinking perimeter, existed on rations that could barely sustain them through a single day. Frostbite claimed limbs as efficiently as Soviet artillery. Disease moved through the frozen bunkers like an invisible army, laying low men who had somehow survived months of combat. And yet the perimeter held. The Totenkopf Division, once a force of ideological zealots unprepared for real warfare, had become something harder and more terrible. A formation of soldiers who understood that surrender meant death, and that death came regardless. Theodor Eicke moved among his men in those frozen weeks with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. The man who had spent the 1930s orchestrating the machinery of the concentration camp system now commanded soldiers on the edge of annihilation, and something in him seemed to burn brighter under that pressure. Veterans who survived Demyansk spoke of Eicke appearing at the most desperate sectors of the line during the height of Soviet assaults. His SS uniform, unmistakable even in the blizzard haze, sometimes wearing civilian clothes beneath to avoid giving the snipers an easy target. He was 58 years old by then, but the men noticed that he seemed to grow more energetic as conditions deteriorated, as if proximity to catastrophe fed something primal within him. His orders to hold ground at any cost were not abstract doctrine. but orders given while standing in trenches, where the cold was so severe that men lost consciousness and froze where they stood. There was no gap between Ike's words and his presence. The division had been shaped by his hand for nearly a decade, and in the crucible of Demyansk, his mythology reached its apex. What the men did not fully understand in those bitter months of early 1943 was that their commander had begun to recognize the impossible mathematics of the Eastern Front with a clarity that bordered on desperate. Ike had always been a man of action rather than reflection, but the veteran officers around him noticed a change in his demeanor as winter deepened. He had written letters and sent reports up the chain of command that, while never explicitly defeatist, contained undertones of grim realism about what the Totenkopf Division faced. The encirclement was not being broken. The relief columns pushing toward Demyansk from outside the pocket were making agonizing progress through Soviet defenses that seemed only to strengthen with each passing week. The losses among his most experienced officers and NCOs had reached catastrophic levels, yet Ike did not withdraw. Instead, he seemed to accelerate, to push himself and his men harder, as if sheer force of will could bend the course of the campaign. In late February of 1943, with the pocket still unbroken and the situation becoming even more dire, Ike made a decision that would reshape the final weeks of his life. He determined that he needed to conduct a personal aerial reconnaissance of the Soviet lines surrounding the pocket, to see with his own eyes where the relief columns were positioned and where the most promising breakthrough point might be. This was not a task that required a divisional commander. It was the kind of mission normally assigned to a junior staff officer or an intelligence specialist. But Ike had never been a man comfortable with remote decision-making. He needed to see, to be present, to command from the front, not just in spirit, but in physical fact. On the morning of the reconnaissance, he boarded a fiercest Storch, a light observation aircraft piloted by an experienced pilot, and took to the air above the frozen steppe. The fiercest Storch was a remarkable machine, slow, fragile, almost comical in its appearance, but capable of operating from tiny landing strips and possessing a ceiling that allowed it to climb above the worst of the Soviet anti-aircraft fire. It had become Ike's preferred method of moving around the divisional area, giving him mobility that ground transport could never match. The aircraft climbed into the grey morning sky above the white expanse of the frozen landscape. Below, the perimeter of the pocket was a faint scar across the snow, the lines marked by the dark shapes of dug-in positions and the occasional plume of smoke from Soviet artillery. Beyond the perimeter, the Soviet positions formed a second, larger ring, and beyond that, the relief columns from the Reich were probing forward through the resistance. From the air, the geometry of the encirclement became brutally clear in a way that maps and reports could never capture. Ike studied the terrain, the disposition of forces, the gaps and weaknesses that might be exploited. What happened next remains locked behind the fog of war and the conflicting testimony of Soviet and German sources. The most credible account suggests that Soviet fighters, Yak aircraft, spotted the slow-moving Stork and moved to intercept it. Whether Ike's pilot attempted to evade them, or whether the aircraft was simply overtaken, is unclear from the surviving records. What is certain is that the Stork, sluggish and defenseless, could not outrun pursuit. A burst of cannon fire raked through the fuselage. The aircraft, crippled, began to descend in a spiral toward the frozen steppe. Whether Ike and his pilot were killed in the air, or whether they survived the crash only to be killed by Soviet forces on the ground, would never be determined with absolute certainty. The German recovery teams who eventually found the wreckage discovered only charred fragments and were unable to identify remains. The East had claimed Theodor Eicke completely, leaving only his absence. The news of Eicke's death moved through the Totenkopf Division like an electric shock. A commander is not merely a military function. He is a symbol of continuity, of leadership, of the institutional memory of a formation. For the men of the Totenkopf Division, Eicke was not simply the commanding officer who had molded them into soldiers. He was the embodiment of the division itself, the man who had taken them from the camps and transformed them into a fighting force, who had survived the brutality of the Eastern Front alongside them, who had demanded the impossible and somehow made it bearable through the force of his own will and presence. To lose him now, in the midst of catastrophe, in the depths of the Demyansk encirclement, was to lose something that anchored their identity. The men wept openly, hardened veterans who had endured months of hunger and cold and constant combat stood in the freezing wind and wept. In the divisional command posts, officers struggled to maintain composure as the implications of the loss settled upon them. Yet paradoxically, Eicke's death became the catalyst for a profound transformation in the character of the Totenkopf Division. His successor was Max Seemann, a career SS officer who was in many ways his opposite, more organizational, less theatrical, focused on efficiency rather than ideology. Simon inherited a division that had been forged in the image of Eicke's fanaticism, but he saw clearly that the old methods could not survive on the modern Eastern Front. The ideological zealotry that had characterized the Totenkopf since its formation in the camps had not disappeared, but it began to be channeled differently. Under Simon's leadership, the division began to evolve from a formation built primarily on political indoctrination and the cult of personality around its commander into a military organization that, while never losing its ideological underpinnings, increasingly emphasized tactical competence, professional military training, and the hard-won expertise of survivors who had learned how to wage war against an enemy with superior numbers and resources. The completion of the breakout from Demyansk in the weeks following Eicke's death coincided with this transition in leadership. When the relief columns finally punched through to the encircled forces in mid-April, the Totenkopf Division emerged from the pocket as a shadow of the formation that had entered it. Barely more than half the men survived. Nearly all the division's heavy equipment had been lost. The officers and NCOs who had carried the division's culture and identity were disproportionately represented among the dead. And yet what emerged from the snow and the carnage was a formation of hardened survivors whose competence in combat had been tested in the most extreme conditions imaginable. The surviving men were no longer the ideological soldiers of the camps and the Western campaign. They were warriors, shaped by adversity, by the knowledge that survival depended on skill and discipline rather than enthusiasm for a cause. When the division withdrew to France in 1943 to be rebuilt and re-equipped with tanks, it carried with it not the ideology of Theodor Eicke, but his legacy of combat effectiveness, divorced from political zealotry, a legacy that would make the Totenkopf Division one of the most feared formations in the SS Panzer Corps. The death of Eicke closed one chapter of the division's history and opened another. In the camps and the Western campaign, he had been the architect of the Totenkopf Division's character. His methods, his demands, his ideological vision had shaped how the men thought about themselves and about the war. But the Eastern Front had proven to be a furnace in which many of the assumptions of the 1930s and early 1940 simply could not survive. The Soviet Union was not France. Encirclement and hunger and freezing cold were not problems that could be solved by fanaticism alone. The division that emerged from Demyansk was harder, more efficient, and in a strange way, more dangerous than the one that had entered it. not because it was more fanatically committed to Nazi ideology, but because it had learned to be effective at killing and destruction in ways that transcended ideology. Eike had created an instrument, and in his absence, that instrument had become refined through the terrible feedback mechanism of desperate warfare. In the decades after the war, historians and veterans alike would debate what Eike's death meant for the division's trajectory. Some argued that his passing freed the Totenkopf from its most virulent ideological strain and allowed it to become a conventional military formation. Others contended that removing Eike's personality from the equation changed nothing fundamental about the division's character or conduct. The truth, as is often the case, lay somewhere between these extremes. Eike's death mattered not because it changed what the division was, but because it accelerated processes that were already underway. The division remained an SS formation, imbued with the values and ideology of the SS. But in the hard school of the Eastern Front, theory had to bow before practice. The men who survived Demyansk had learned that battles were won through tactics, coordination, marksmanship, and the willingness to endure, rather than through passionate commitment to ideology alone. Under Simon's command, these lessons were institutionalized. The Totenkopf Division entered its reconstruction phase, not as a militia of ideological fanatics, but as a professional military formation, where ideology provided the framework and motivation, but military competence determined survival. The snow and ice of Demyansk had taken Theodor Eike and nearly 10,000 of his men. The remainder, the survivors who stumbled out of the pocket in the spring of 1943, carried with them the weight of that catastrophe and the knowledge of what they had endured. When they returned to France, they carried as well the seeds of a transformation that would define the final phase of the war on the Eastern Front. The Totenkopf Division had been tested in the fire and had not broken. It had lost its founding commander, but gained something harder and more dangerous: the confidence of men who had faced annihilation and lived. In the months that followed, that confidence would be channeled into a rebuilding effort that would create an armored formation unlike any the division had previously fielded. The Death's Head insignia would soon be emblazoned on tanks and self-propelled guns. The men who would crew those machines would be veterans of Demyansk, and they would carry into the future battles of the Eastern Front not the memory of Theodor Eike, but the spirit of survival that Demyansk had forged. The spring of 1943 brought a reprieve that no one in the Totenkopf Division quite believed would last. After nearly 2 years of almost continuous combat on the Eastern Front, the survivors were pulled back across the Soviet frontier and directed westward toward occupied France. The men who arrived at the training grounds near Versailles in April were transformed by experience into something harder and colder than the political soldiers who had marched into Russia in 1941. They had learned how to survive in conditions that should have killed them. They had watched Theodor Eike conduct his last operations before his death in March would ripple through the division's ranks like shock. Now they would be rebuilt, not as a concentration camp guard force or as ideological militia, but as the spearhead of a mechanized war machine. The division that was withdrawn from the Demyansk disaster numbered fewer than 5,000 effective combat troops and virtually no serviceable vehicles. What had been authorized as a full-strength division of 18,000 men existed now only as a skeleton. The armored vehicles that had survived the winter fighting were either completely worn out or destroyed. Most of the men had lost everything except their lives and their uniforms, and some of them had lost faith in the latter. Yet Himmler and the SS leadership saw in this devastation not a failure but an opportunity. The Totenkopf would not be reformed as an infantry division. Instead, it would be reconstructed from the ground upward as a Panzer Grenadier division, a hybrid formation, combining armored infantry transported in half-tracked vehicles with organic tank and assault gun support. This transformation would require months of intensive work, enormous quantities of equipment, and the careful selection of experienced personnel to meld the survivors with fresh conscripts and volunteers. The rebuilding process began in late April, when the division was formally reorganized and redesignated as the 2nd SS Panzergrenadier Division Totenkopf. The new structure allocated 3 rifle battalions, each transported in standard half-track carriers, supported by a tank company equipped with the latest Panzer Mark III tanks. Additional firepower came from platoons of self-propelled guns, engineering companies, reconnaissance troops, and artillery batteries. On paper, the division's authorized strength reached roughly 12,000 men, though achieving that figure would require the careful accumulation of replacements throughout the summer and autumn. The planning documents called for the acquisition of more than 120 armored vehicles of various types, representing an enormous commitment of resources, at a moment when German industry was straining to supply all theaters of war. That such an allocation was approved and largely fulfilled testified to the SS's privileged access to production and to Hitler's continuing confidence in Himmler's elite formations, even after the disasters in Russia. The selection of officers and men to fill the division's new structure was conducted with unusual care. The surviving veterans from Demyansk and the Luga were preserved in the cadre, distributed as platoon leaders, section commanders, and company sergeants. These men carried a hard-won expertise that could not be manufactured in training camps. They knew how to position men in defense against overwhelming odds. They understood the psychology of survival under sustained artillery bombardment. They had experienced the intimate nature of small unit combat on the Eastern Front and had emerged, against extraordinary odds, alive and still capable of functioning. Equally important, their presence lent credibility and authority when these hardened professionals trained the stream of replacements who arrived throughout the spring and summer. The new recruits, many of them very young, and volunteers to the SS divisions rather than conscripts, looked to these veterans and absorbed their lessons in ways that no formal training syllabus could replicate. The equipment began to arrive in May and June, in quantities that seemed almost miraculous to men who had fought in Russia, with equipment held together by improvisation and prayer. The new Panzer Mark III tanks represented a substantial upgrade from the older machines the division had operated in 1941. These were equipped with longer-barreled guns, capable of engaging enemy armor at distances where the defender possessed a genuine advantage. Self-propelled assault guns, vehicles that mounted 75mm guns on mobile chassis, arrived in numbers that provided organic anti-tank firepower at the battalion level. The standard half-track carriers that would transport the Panzer Grenadier Riflemen were robust vehicles capable of operating in appalling conditions, though their thin armor offered protection only against small arms fire and shell splinters. The logistical apparatus that had collapsed in Russia was rebuilt systematically with supply trucks, fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, and spare parts organized into a supply train capable of sustaining mobile warfare across hundreds of kilometers of territory. The training regimen that unfolded across the summer of 1943 was methodical and intense. The division's new commander, Brigade Führer Max Seemann, presided over a training program designed to convert the Panzer Grenadier battalions into properly coordinated mechanized infantry, capable of working in close coordination with armor. The veterans conducted instruction on the tactics they had developed through hard experience, teaching the young soldiers how infantry should fight from half-track vehicles, how to dismount under fire, and how to establish mutually supporting defensive positions, using their mechanized mobility as an advantage. Tank crews conducted gunnery practice on established ranges, firing live ammunition at moving targets to ingrain the muscle memory and split-second decision-making required in actual combat. Reconnaissance troops practiced their craft on the rolling terrain of northern France, learning to move without being detected and to gather the kind of information that commanders required to make sound tactical decisions. Engineers trained on obstacles, bridging techniques, and methods for clearing minefields, tasks that would become increasingly relevant as the division moved toward combat. The entire division practiced combined arms tactics, in which tanks, self-propelled guns, and mechanized infantry worked together in coordinated assaults that lasted for days at a time. By late autumn of 1943, the Totenkopf Division had been transformed from a recours, exhausted remnant into what appeared on paper to be one of the most comprehensively equipped German military formations in existence. The authorized complement of men had been more or less achieved, bringing the division's strength to approximately 12,000 personnel. The equipment inventory was remarkably complete, with the exception of a few categories of specialized vehicles that were simply unavailable anywhere in the German order of battle. The training status of the division was assessed as good to excellent, with the caveat that the young replacements had not yet been tested in actual combat, and therefore could not be reliably predicted to perform under extreme stress. Yet, even this limitation seemed minor compared to what the division had already accomplished in rebuilding itself. The officers and men looked at their division's new equipment, at the training grounds they had mastered, and at the organizational cohesion that had been restored, and they could begin to believe that despite the catastrophes of Russia, despite the loss of Eicher, despite everything that the Eastern Front had inflicted upon them, the Totenkopf had emerged stronger and more dangerous than before. The psychological dimensions of the rebuilding process ran deeper than mere equipment and organization. Many of the men who had survived Russia harbored private doubts about whether German victory remained possible. The illusions that had sustained them in 1941 and 1942 had evaporated in the mud and cold of the Eastern Front. Some soldiers recognized, though they could never voice this recognition aloud, that the war might ultimately be lost. Yet the very process of rebuilding the division, the lavish equipment allocations, the sense that Hitler and Himmler still regarded the SS formations as the instruments through which victory could yet be snatched from catastrophe, created a countervailing psychology of purpose and elite status. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They had survived where ordinary men had died. They had been equipped with the finest weapons available. They had been selected and trained as an elite formation. The ideology that had shaped them in the pre-war years and throughout the Russian campaign had been reinforced through their experience of survival, and now took on a more hardened, secular character. Their fanaticism was no longer the naive enthusiasm of 1941, but the grim determination of men who had been tested in the worst conditions imaginable and had not broken. The relationship between the Totenkopf Division and the regular Wehrmacht remained complex and shadowed by contempt, even as the division's martial capabilities were demonstrably rebuilt. Wehrmacht officers continued to regard the SS divisions with suspicion and resentment, viewing them as political instruments that had been promoted beyond their competence. Yet the evidence of the Totenkopf's combat record, whatever the ideological objections to its methods and its origins, could not be entirely dismissed. The division had held the Luga line against overwhelming odds. It had survived the Demyansk encirclement when many ordinary divisions had collapsed entirely. The casualties it had sustained testified to its willingness to accept frightful losses rather than yield ground. By the autumn of 1943, as the division was being rebuilt in France, these accomplishments carried weight even among officers who despised everything the division represented politically. The Totenkopf was no longer a militia playing at warfare. It was a battle-hardened formation that had learned to survive in the most demanding combat conditions imaginable. In the months after Eicke's death, the question of command had been settled in favor of Brigade Führer Max Seemann, a professional soldier who brought a more systematic approach to leadership than Eicke's volatile intensity had allowed. Seemann was not a product of the concentration camp system. He had risen through the ranks of the SS Verfügungstruppe, the armed SS that predated the war, and he possessed a genuinely professional understanding of military operations. Under his command, the rebuilding of the Totenkopf proceeded with greater methodical precision than Eicke's erratic leadership might have permitted. Seemann was respected by both the SS men and by Wehrmacht officers, a rare achievement that spoke to his capabilities as a military leader. Yet Seemann did not seek to erase or minimize the division's ideological character. Rather, he integrated the division's fanatical commitment to its cause with a more sophisticated understanding of how mechanized warfare could be conducted with maximum effectiveness. The result was a formation that combined the ruthlessness of its ideology with the professionalism of a genuine military organization. The decision to provide the Totenkopf Division with the equipment and resources necessary for a complete transformation reflected Hitler's continuing faith in the SS divisions as instruments of his will and Himmler's political skill in securing those resources, despite the competing demands of other commands. The Nazi regime, even in the autumn of 1943, with the war clearly entering a new and more desperate phase, continued to privilege its ideological formations. The Waffen-SS divisions were allocated equipment at rates substantially higher than comparable Wehrmacht formations. The political rationale was clear to anyone who understood the regime's logic. The SS divisions represented the Nazi state's most reliable military forces, formations that could be relied upon to execute orders without question and to maintain political loyalty even when military circumstances deteriorated. The Totenkopf's reconstruction was an investment in this political reliability as much as in military capability. Hitler wanted to know that, when he commanded his most elite formations to hold ground at any cost or to launch offensives that the situation seemed to render hopeless, those formations would obey without hesitation or negotiation. By the beginning of 1944, the Totenkopf Division stood at the apex of its material power and organizational sophistication. The men who had marched into Russia as inexperienced political soldiers had been replaced by a hardened corps of survivors, commanding newly trained recruits, equipped with the finest weapons the German war machine could produce. The division was no longer primarily an instrument of the concentration camp system, though its ideological foundations and its willingness to commit atrocities remained fundamentally unchanged from its origins. Rather, it had evolved into something more complex and more dangerous, a formation that combined ideological fanaticism with genuine military competence, equipped with the resources to project force across vast distances, and led by commanders who understood both the ideology that animated the division and the technical requirements of modern mechanized warfare. The Totenkopf had become one of the most dangerous military formations in the entire German order of battle, a force that could bring weight and determination to whatever sector of the front it was directed. Its test in this new configuration would come quickly, as the division prepared to deploy once more into the furnace of the Eastern Front, and its victims would number in the tens of thousands before the war ended. The winter of 1942 gave way to a desperate spring across southern Russia. The German Sixth Army lay broken at Stalingrad, its remnants surrendered or frozen in the rubble. To the south and west, the Wehrmacht faced a catastrophe of strategic proportions. Soviet forces, flush with victory and riding a tide of momentum, pressed westward across the Don and toward the industrial heartland of Ukraine. The command structure that had once flowed with Hitler's confidence now fractured under the weight of reality. It was in this moment of acute vulnerability that a single city would become the proving ground for the rebuilding of German military power on the Eastern Front. That city was Kharkov, and its recapture would come to symbolize the resurrection of German operational capability, even as it masked a strategic exhaustion that no amount of tactical brilliance could remedy. Kharkov stood as the fourth largest city in the Soviet Union, a sprawling industrial metropolis built on the banks of the Lopan River in eastern Ukraine. The Wehrmacht had captured it in the previous year's drive into southern Russia, but the shock of Stalingrad and the Soviet winter counteroffensive had forced a withdrawal. By late January of 1943, Soviet forces had retaken the city, and their commanders looked outward with the hunger of men who sensed opportunity. The question facing the German High Command was whether the Eastern Front could be stabilized at all. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, possessed both the tactical skill and the moral courage to deliver an honest assessment. The Wehrmacht could not win this war through attrition, but he believed, with the concentration of available reserves, that he could achieve a brilliant tactical reverse that might buy time for a negotiated settlement, or at least stabilize the front before resources drained away entirely. Kharkov would be his stage, and the SS Panzer Corps would be his instrument. The SS Panzer Corps itself had undergone a profound transformation. The Totenkopf Division, bloodied and drained on the Eastern Front, had been withdrawn to France in 1942 and rebuilt into a modern armored formation. Its ranks now included hardened veterans whose survival through brutal winters and savage encounters had forged them into something far more formidable than the ideological warriors who had first crossed into Soviet territory. The division had been re-equipped with modern tanks, self-propelled guns, and the supporting arms of a professional military organization. Alongside it in the corps were the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, commanded by the charismatic Theodor Wisch, and Das Reich Division, units that had also been withdrawn and reformed. These three SS Panzer divisions represented the cream of the mechanized reserves available to the German command. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and driven by a fierce competitive pride that bordered on arrogance. Yet what distinguished them most was their organic cohesion. These men had trained together, fought together, and suffered together. They understood one another's movements with an almost intuitive precision. The plan itself was audacious in its simplicity. Soviet forces driving westward had overextended their supply lines across a blasted steppe. The Red Army, for all its growing strength, still struggled with the coordination of its forward elements. Manstein's concept called for the SS Panzer Corps and supporting German formations to attack from the northwest, while another Panzer Corps would strike from the south. The Soviets would be caught between these forces and hammered. The key terrain was a series of gently rolling plateaus and river crossings northwest of Kharkov. The Totenkopf Division would lead the assault through some of the most difficult country. As late January turned to early February, the division completed its concentration and received its operational orders. The men, many of them drawn from conscription into the ranks, rather than remaining as purely volunteer SS formations, steeled themselves for what lay ahead. The eastern sun rose cold and weak over the Ukrainian steppe. The coming battle would determine whether the Totenkopf Division had truly been reborn, or whether it remained a broken instrument struggling to prove its relevance. The offensive began on the 19th of February, 1943, and within days, the sheer weight of the German mechanized assault began to shatter the Soviet formations in its path. The Totenkopf Division drove hard through the snow and mud, its panzer crews executing practiced maneuvers with deadly precision. The tanks, the newer Mark IVs with their upgraded guns, proved devastatingly effective against the lighter Soviet armor that contested the ground. The division's panzer grenadiers, the mobile infantry, deployed from their armored half-tracks in coordinated assaults that drove home the lesson that the SS formations were no longer the semi-trained political soldiers of 2 years prior. Soviet resistance, while fierce, proved unable to organize itself into anything approaching a coherent defense. The weather, paradoxically, aided the German assault. The spring thaw had not yet come in full, and the ground, though muddy, remained passable. Supply lines held. The momentum built with each passing day. By late February, the Totenkopf Division was driving hard toward Kharkov itself from the northwest, while the Leibstandarte and Das Reich pressed in from other directions, encircling the city in a classic maneuver of encirclement. The fighting around Kharkov itself took on a character fundamentally different from the open field maneuvers that had preceded it. Urban warfare always favors the defender, and the Soviets, recognizing the strategic importance of their reclaimed city, had prepared extensive defensive positions within and around the metropolitan area. The Totenkopf Division, like the other SS formations, began the task of clearing city blocks, destroying stubborn strongpoints, and rooting out Soviet defenders from the maze of streets and buildings. The coordination between the 3 SS panzer divisions became the model of what mechanized warfare could achieve. Armor would suppress Soviet positions while panzer grenadiers dismounted and cleared buildings. Anti-tank guns would establish new positions to cover the next bound forward. The process was systematic, methodical, and ruthlessly professional. The division's officers, many of them bearing the scars of the Eastern Front already, led from the front, and their men followed with the kind of aggressive determination that marks units operating at the peak of operational efficiency. Soviet counterattacks, though launched with characteristic Soviet determination and disregard for casualties, failed to dislodge the German formations digging into the city. By March the 9th, 1943, Kharkov lay in German hands once more. The Soviet forces that had occupied it retreated eastward, abandoning the city rather than being encircled and destroyed. The SS Panzer Corps had achieved what seemed impossible just weeks before, a stunning operational victory in the very heart of the Eastern Front. Reports filtered back to Berlin with the kind of triumphalism that had become rare in recent months. Hitler himself took notice, and the prestige of the SS formations soared accordingly. The Totenkopf Division was cited for its role in the victory. Its commanders received decorations. Photographs of the division's tanks rolling through the streets of Kharkov were disseminated through the German propaganda apparatus. For the men of the division, the victory was more than symbolic. It proved that they had been successfully rebuilt. It demonstrated that, with proper equipment and training, they remained formidable soldiers. Many of the veterans who had survived Demyansk and the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front felt, perhaps for the first time since 1941, that they had achieved something worth the price they had paid. Yet the shadow that would ultimately consume this triumph was already visible to those who understood strategic realities. Manstein had achieved exactly what he said he would achieve: a brilliant tactical victory that did nothing to address the fundamental imbalance in the Eastern Front. German reserves had been partially reconstituted, but the Soviets, by the spring of 1943, were producing tanks and training new formations at rates that dwarfed German capacity. The very success at Kharkov came at a moment when German production was being redirected toward new wonder weapons and pet projects. The oil that drove the tanks of the Totenkopf Division came from sources increasingly threatened by Soviet advances. The manpower pool from which replacements could be drawn was being depleted by the endless demands of multiple fronts. Within weeks of Kharkov, Hitler would commit to the massive operation at Kursk, an even more ambitious attempt to regain the strategic initiative. But Kursk would prove to be something fundamentally different. Not a brilliant limited maneuver, but a grinding battle of attrition that would shatter what reserves remained. The Kharkov victory had another, more immediate consequence. It accelerated the integration of the SS Panzer divisions into the highest circles of German operational planning. Their demonstrable effectiveness in combat now gave them an influence over strategic decisions that their ideological loyalty had already secured. When Hitler needed something done, increasingly, it was to the SS that he turned. When he wanted reserves committed to check a breakthrough, it was SS Panzer formations that were rushed forward. The Totenkopf Division, which had begun its existence as guards in concentration camps, had been transformed by the crucible of warfare into one of the most reliable instruments of German military power. This very fact carried with it profound consequences. As the war progressed and German forces retreated across the Russian steppe, the lines between military necessity and ideological terror would blur. The same ruthlessness that made the division effective in conventional combat would shape its conduct toward Soviet prisoners, toward civilians, toward anyone deemed an enemy of the Reich. The victory at Kharkov had proven the division's military prowess. It had done nothing to impose constraints on how that prowess would be employed. The international response to the Kharkov victory was muted. The Western Allies, preparing for an invasion of North Africa and then Sicily and Italy, took note but did not shift their strategic calculations. The Soviets, for their part, recognized the setback but understood it in the context of their expanding resources and manpower. What Kharkov demonstrated, in the clearest possible terms, was that the Wehrmacht remained capable of brilliant operational maneuvers, despite its overall strategic predicament. It showed that, properly concentrated and properly led, German mechanized formations could still defeat Soviet forces in conventional combat. It also demonstrated something else, that the SS Panzer divisions, with their particular culture of aggression and their hierarchical loyalty structure, were perfectly suited to the kind of warfare that the Eastern Front had become. This recognition would shape the final years of the war, pulling the Totenkopf Division and its sister formations deeper into the most brutal aspects of Nazi Germany's conduct of the war. The victory at Kharkov marked a zenith of tactical brilliance, but it pointed toward no future other than continuing decline. The rebuilding of the Totenkopf Division had reached its peak. The men who fought through Kharkov were the best trained, best equipped soldiers the division would field during the entire war. Equipment losses would eventually exceed replacements. Training standards would slip as replacements came from increasingly desperate sources. The pool of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers would be depleted faster than new ones could be developed. The supply of fuel and ammunition would become increasingly uncertain. The roads back toward Berlin would grow longer with each passing month. But in the spring of 1943, standing amid the ruins of Kharkov, the survivors of the Totenkopf Division could look back on a path that had taken them from the concentration camps of the 1930s through the grinding horror of Demyansk, and finally to this moment of vindication and restored pride. They did not know, could not have known, that Kursk lay just months away, and that the battles to follow would dwarf even the scale and intensity of what they had endured. The Kharkov victory was real, its tactical brilliance undeniable, its human cost measured in both German and Soviet blood. But it was also a crest, a moment of restored confidence that preceded a long and accelerating descent into a darkness from which there would be no emergence. The death's head insignia, painted on the tanks and vehicles of the Totenkopf Division, rolling through Kharkov streets, marked a formation that had proven its lethality. In the months and years that remained, it would have ample opportunity to demonstrate that terrible truth across the wreckage of the Eastern Front. By the summer of 1943, the German army had learned a bitter lesson across nearly 2 years of fighting on the Soviet frontier. Victory no longer came through rapid encirclement and collapse of enemy will. The Red Army had transformed itself into a formidable opponent, increasingly sophisticated in defensive techniques, and the vast distances of the Eastern Front meant that every German advance stretched supply lines to the breaking point, while allowing Soviet forces time to withdraw, regroup, and counterattack. Yet Hitler and his generals still believed one more major offensive could shift the balance. They had identified a weakness in the Soviet lines, a massive bulge or salient that jutted westward near the city of Kursk. Here was an opportunity, they reasoned, to pincer Soviet forces from north and south, to destroy a significant portion of the Red Army in a decisive engagement, and to regain the strategic initiative that had slipped from German hands after the catastrophe of Stalingrad. Operation Citadel was born from this calculation. Ambitious, dangerous, and ultimately a gamble that Germany could no longer afford to lose. The Totenkopf Division, rebuilt and re-equipped as an SS Panzergrenadier formation with modern tanks and assault guns, was assigned to the southern assault under Army Detachment Kempf. The division had been pulled back to France after the grinding attrition of the Demyansk pocket and the eastern campaigns. Its survivors merged with fresh recruits and new equipment. The veterans who had endured the frozen hell of the steppes brought with them a certain grim fatalism, a knowledge that German formations, however well equipped and well led, were no longer guaranteed superiority over Soviet armor and men. Younger soldiers arrived fresh with ideological conviction and mechanical training, but lacking the hard-won intuition that kept men alive in combat. This mixture of experience and inexperience would define the Totenkopf's performance at Kursk. The division received new Panzer V tanks, also known as Panthers, sleek and dangerous machines with superior gun power to their Soviet counterparts, along with Panzer IVs and armored personnel carriers. On paper, the force that assembled in the south was formidable, a concentrated mass of German mechanized power preparing to strike. What the German High Command did not fully comprehend was that Soviet intelligence had penetrated the planning of Operation Citadel months in advance. The Red Army knew when the Germans would attack, where they would attack, and in what strength. More crucially, they had used this knowledge to construct defensive lines of staggering depth and sophistication. Soviet engineers had dug multiple belts of anti-tank ditches, minefields of unprecedented density, and arranged artillery and anti-tank gun positions in overlapping fields of fire that could suppress German infantry and destroy tanks from concealment. The Kursk salient was ringed with fortifications that made the strongest positions the Germans had faced in France look primitive by comparison. When the Totenkopf Division and its sister formations began their advance on the first day of July 1943, they were driving toward defenses that had been prepared with months of labor and the full weight of Soviet industrial and human resources. The initial shock when armored vehicles began to strike mines or fall under concentrated anti-tank fire revealed immediately that this would be no swift breakthrough. The Totenkopf sector of the attack lay in the southern portion of the salient, and the division drove forward with determination. despite mounting losses. Panzer V tanks pushed ahead, their long-barreled guns searching for Soviet anti-tank positions, while armored grenadiers dismounted to assault fortified positions on foot. The Soviet defenders fought with the kind of stubborn resistance that had become characteristic of Red Army combat by mid-1943. They were no longer the disorganized, panicked troops of the opening weeks of Barbarossa. They held their ground, called in artillery support from positions further back, and moved reserves to threaten German flanks. The advance became a grinding, attritional struggle, where German technological superiority in individual tank design provided less advantage than sheer numbers and defensive positioning. The Totenkopf Division's gunners and tank commanders, many of them veterans, used superior gunnery and combined arms tactics to whittle down Soviet positions. But every kilometer gained cost them tanks and men that could not be easily replaced. As the offensive continued through the second and third weeks of July, the scale of the engagement became clear. German and Soviet forces were locked in what would become the largest tank battle in history, a massive armored engagement around the city of Prokhorovka that would eventually involve hundreds of tanks and assault guns across a front stretching many kilometers. The Totenkopf Division, still advancing from the south as part of Kempf's force, was drawn into this maelstrom of armored combat. Prokhorovka itself was never the clear objective for the southern wing of the German attack, in the way histories would later suggest. But the fact remained that German and Soviet armored masses converged upon the region in a desperate bid for tactical advantage. The division's Panzer V tanks, with their powerful 88mm guns and sophisticated fire control systems, could outfight Soviet tanks in direct engagement, but they could not be everywhere simultaneously. Soviet T-34 medium tanks, T-66 tanks, and newer T-43 models poured forward in waves, accepting losses to achieve local superiority through sheer weight of numbers. The engagement around Prokhorovka and the broader Kursk operations became a test of whether German quality could overcome Soviet quantity and depth. What made the Kursk operation catastrophic for German strategy was not merely tactical failure, but the broader strategic context. As the Totenkopf Division and other Wehrmacht and SS formations battered themselves against the Soviet defensive positions, events were unfolding far to the west that demanded immediate German attention. In Sicily, Anglo-American forces had begun an invasion of Axis-held territory. The Western Allies were finally opening the second front that German planners had feared since 1942, and the implications were immediately apparent to Hitler and the German High Command. Resources needed for the fight against the Soviet Union were suddenly demanded for the defense of Italy and the Western Mediterranean. The political and strategic basis for Operation Citadel crumbled almost overnight. Hitler made the decision to cancel the offensive, diverting forces to counter the threat in the south. The Totenkopf Division, having pushed forward with significant losses and without achieving the hoped-for breakthrough, received orders to disengage and prepare for redeployment. The dream of a decisive victory over the Red Army died in the mud and smoke around Kursk, and with it died the last German hope for strategic victory on the Eastern Front. The human cost of the Totenkopf's participation in Operation Citadel was severe. The division had entered the battle with carefully husbanded equipment and men rebuilt during the months since Demyansk. In the 3 weeks of combat around Kursk, it had suffered thousands of casualties. Panzer companies that had begun the operation with 5 or 6 tanks operational were reduced to 1 or 2 by the final week. The division's grenadier battalions, the armored infantry who assaulted fortified positions and held ground that the tanks had taken, had been ground down through constant combat against an enemy that showed no signs of breaking. The losses in junior officers and experienced non-commissioned officers were particularly grievous. These men could not be quickly replaced. A veteran tank commander with 2 years of experience on the Eastern Front could not be replaced by a fresh recruit, no matter how well trained or ideologically motivated. The Totenkopf Division was learning, alongside every other German formation, that the Eastern Front demanded an endless supply of men and material. Germany's economy, however impressive in its achievements, could not sustain the replacement rate necessary to offset Soviet casualties and maintain the initiative. The psychological impact of the failure at Kursk reverberated through the entire German army. For the men of the Totenkopf Division, veterans and newcomers alike, the realization was becoming unavoidable that German military science and tactical superiority could not by themselves overcome the sheer scale of Soviet resources and manpower. The early campaigns in France and the opening months in Russia had been punctuated by moments of triumph, by successful encirclements and enemy forces destroyed in vast numbers. By mid-1943, the victories came harder, cost more, and achieved less. The Kursk operation crystallized this transition. The Germans had not been decisively beaten in the tactical sense. The Totenkopf Division and other formations had inflicted heavy casualties and had fought with discipline and courage. But the Soviets had not broken, the salient had not been eliminated, and the strategic picture for Germany had only deteriorated. For the men in the ranks, this meant that the war would not end in victory, or if it would, the ending lay so far in the future as to be nearly impossible to imagine. The Totenkopf Division's performance at Kursk demonstrated both the continued tactical effectiveness of German armored formations and the fundamental exhaustion of German strategic capacity. The division's tank crews and armored grenadiers had fought with the professionalism that came from long experience, had coordinated movement and firepower with skill, and had inflicted significant casualties on Soviet forces. Yet all of this had amounted to a failure to achieve the fundamental objective of the operation. The Soviet defensive lines had held, despite the weight of German attacks. The hoped-for breakthrough had never materialized. The armored reserves that Hitler had expected to pour through a rupture in the Soviet lines remained bottled up by the sheer depth and complexity of the defensive position. In the aftermath of Kursk, it became clear that the Germans had been trying to achieve something that was no longer possible, that the shift in the balance of power on the Eastern Front was not a temporary phenomenon, but a fundamental change in the military situation. The decision to cancel Operation Citadel and withdraw the Totenkopf Division from the Kursk sector forced the unit into a new reality. The days of German strategic offensives on the Eastern Front were over. The Totenkopf Division had been built up and rebuilt specifically to fight the kind of major armored offensive that Citadel represented. Now that that opportunity had passed, the division faced a future of reactive operations, of responding to Soviet attacks rather than launching German attacks. Supply lines that had been stretched supporting an offensive could be consolidated, but the cessation of the attack meant that the initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. The Totenkopf would spend the remainder of the war fighting to delay Soviet advances, to hold ground temporarily, to conduct rearguard actions that bought time but could not reverse the larger trajectory. For Theodor Eicke and the surviving members of his original cadre, this transition represented a fundamental failure of the division's purpose, even though Eicke himself would be dead within months. For younger officers and men who had joined the division after 1941, the reality of permanent retreat and declining prospects was becoming the defining experience of their service. The Kursk offensive marked the end of an era for the German army, and specifically for the Totenkopf Division. The massive Soviet defensive preparations had been visible to German intelligence. The difficulties of breakthrough warfare against a well-prepared enemy had been demonstrated extensively since Demyansk, and the broader strategic context had made clear that Germany could not afford the losses necessary for such operations. Yet the German High Command, driven by Hitler's strategic wishfulness and the institutional belief that tactical and operational genius could overcome material and numerical disadvantages, had launched the attack anyway. The Totenkopf Division had paid for this gamble in blood and treasure, in men lost and equipment destroyed. The division had fought well, as formations that had been blooded in the cruelest fighting of the Eastern Front tended to fight. But all the courage and tactical skill in the world could not restore the strategic balance that had tipped irreversibly toward the Soviet Union. From this point forward, the Totenkopf Division would retreat. It would fight hard. It would conduct operational masterpieces of withdrawal and rearguard action, but it would never again stand in a prepared position, waiting for the Soviet attack to break against its defenses. The Eastern Front had exhausted the possibility of German victory. Kursk confirmed what the losses since Stalingrad had already made clear. The war would be decided by industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and strategic will, none of which Germany possessed in sufficient measure to overcome the combined resources arrayed against it. As the Totenkopf Division withdrew from Kursk toward new defensive positions further west, the men in the ranks carried with them the weight of this failure. Some of the newer recruits would be returning to the Eastern Front for the first time, under conditions of despair rather than hope. The veterans understood that they had witnessed a turning point, that the trajectory of the war had fundamentally shifted and would not reverse. The losses incurred at Kursk had come not in the context of a German offensive that was sustaining itself forward, but rather in the context of an offensive that had been called off, that had achieved none of its fundamental objectives, and that had depleted German resources for minimal strategic return. The division's commanders, professional soldiers who understood the implications of the failed offensive, began planning for a future that looked increasingly like a fighting withdrawal across terrain that Soviet forces were determined to liberate. The Totenkopf Division had transformed from ideological militia to hardened armored force over the course of more than 3 years of combat, but even that hard professionalism could not compensate for the fundamental imbalance that had emerged between German and Soviet military power by the summer of 1943. Kursk had been the last chance for a German strategic victory, and that chance had been squandered in mud and blood for no ultimate gain. The summer of 1943 began with a German army still convinced of its capacity to shape the course of the war. The Totenkopf Division emerged from Kursk bruised but intact, its tanks and self-propelled guns still operational, its men still possessing the lethal competence that had earned them a fearsome reputation across the Eastern Front. Yet the campaign at Kursk had altered something fundamental in the strategic equation. The Soviets had absorbed the German offensive, held their ground, and immediately launched counteroffensives of their own that pushed German forces backward across the same steppes they had conquered 2 years earlier. For the Totenkopf Division, the months that followed would transform it from an instrument of German aggression into a perpetually reactive force, rushed from crisis to crisis, bleeding men and tanks into the mud of Ukraine, without the prospect of meaningful rest or reconstitution. The immediate aftermath of the failed Kursk offensive saw German commanders scrambling to stabilize their lines. The Totenkopf Division, now part of the 48th Panzer Corps under the command of General Otto von Knobelsdorff, found itself pulled northward to counter a massive Soviet breakthrough near Polotsk. The journey itself reflected the deteriorating situation. Supply lines stretched to their breaking point, fuel rationed with increasing desperation. Soldiers traveling in trucks and on foot, across roads that became quagmires within hours of heavy rain. Officers briefed their men with language calculated to appeal to ideological conviction rather than military logic. They spoke of holding the line against the Bolshevik tide, of preventing the annihilation of German civilization, of fighting not for territory, but for the survival of their families and homeland. These words, familiar to men who had been marinated in Nazi ideology since their recruitment into the SS, carried less weight now. The soldiers of the Totenkopf Division understood on a visceral level what the mathematics of the Eastern Front meant. They were outnumbered. Soviet production was replacing losses faster than German factories could maintain the Wehrmacht. Winter was coming again. The strategic situation that had looked merely grave 6 months earlier now appeared catastrophic. Throughout July and August of 1943, the Totenkopf Division operated as what German officers termed a Feuerwehrverband, a fire brigade formation. When Soviet forces achieved breakthroughs, when German defensive lines collapsed under the weight of waves of infantry and massed artillery, the division received urgent orders to move immediately to the threatened sector and restore the situation. It was exhausting work that required constant movement, leaving positions after barely holding them for days, loading vehicles in the dark, racing towards sounds of artillery that grew progressively louder as the division approached each new crisis. The men were sleeping in 2-hour rotations, eating cold rations, conducting maintenance on tanks under fire, and losing comrades with a regularity that became almost mundane. Non-commissioned officers had to be constantly aggressive in their leadership, simply to keep soldiers focused on immediate tasks, rather than yielding to the paralyzing fatigue and fear that accumulated with each passing day. The transformation that had begun at Demyansk, from ideological militia to hardened professional soldiers, accelerated under these conditions. Survival demanded expertise. Men who could service tanks quickly, who could read terrain and choose defensible positions, who could coordinate fire and ammunition distribution. These men lived longer than those who could not. Ideology faded into the background as the immediate contest between technical competence and death became the dominant reality. The physical environment of Ukraine in the latter months of 1943 imposed its own brutal calculus on the division's operation. The initial breakout from Kursk had occurred in summer heat, across dry, hard ground that allowed vehicles and armor to maneuver with reasonable speed. As July turned to August and the division moved deeper into the country, the landscape began to work against German mobility. Rivers that had been shallow in spring became serious obstacles. Forests provided cover for Soviet defensive lines and ambush positions. Most critically, as the autumn rains began, the famous Rasputitsa, the mud season, transformed roads into impassable sloughs and fields into morasses where tanks could advance only yards per hour. Supply convoys moving eastward to resupply the division became the targets of constant Soviet air attacks and partisan operations. Fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement parts were perpetually in short supply. Wounded men had to be evacuated greater distances to reach field hospitals, and infection became nearly as lethal as the original wounds. The division's medical personnel worked in chaotic conditions, often operating in buildings damaged by artillery fire, dealing with casualties who arrived in numbers that swamped existing capacity. The human cost of the summer and autumn offensive operations was staggering. The Totenkopf Division began 1943 with an authorized strength of roughly 15,000 men. By September, it had lost more than 40% of that force, killed, wounded, or missing. Officer casualty rates were even more severe. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers, the men whose expertise and leadership kept units functioning, were being killed and wounded faster than replacements could arrive from training depots in Germany. A 19-year-old replacement, arriving from a propaganda company or a Hitler Youth Leadership School, could not immediately replace an experienced Untersturmführer who had survived 3 years of combat on the Eastern Front. The institutional knowledge embedded in veteran soldiers, how to read Soviet tactics, how to sight a defensive position that would not be overrun, how to navigate the complex logistics of keeping a panzer company supplied and combat effective, was bleeding away in real time. Officers began noting in their after-action reports that the level of independence and tactical initiative shown by their men was declining as experienced soldiers were replaced by younger recruits who had not yet learned the harsh lessons of survival in mechanized warfare. The psychological exhaustion that accumulated during these months was perhaps even more damaging than the material losses. Soldiers who had believed that they were fighting a winnable war, even after Stalingrad, began to confront a more terrible truth. They were losing. The Soviets were not a defeated enemy desperately holding on to the last inch of ground. Soviet forces were attacking with increasing sophistication, coordinating armor, infantry, and artillery with a precision that reflected months of training and hard experience. Soviet tank designs, particularly the T-34 and the newer T-44, were matching German tanks in armor and firepower, while possessing the advantage of simplicity and numbers. Soviet commanders at the operational level were learning to concentrate force, to break through German lines, and to exploit breakthroughs with mobile formations that harassed German retreat routes. Veterans of the Totenkopf Division had spent the last 2 years telling themselves that they were superior soldiers, serving a superior ideology, fighting for a supreme cause. The evidence visible from the front lines began to contradict these beliefs with terrible clarity. They were losing because the Soviet Union could replace its losses, and Germany could not. They were losing because German strategic decisions had been catastrophic. They were losing because the material and human resources committed to the war by the Allies were becoming overwhelming. Morale among the soldiers did not collapse entirely. The SS cultural conditioning remained powerful, and the men of the Totenkopf Division possessed an esprit de corps born from shared suffering that genuine army units with conscript replacements could not match. Officers observed that even as the military situation deteriorated, the division's soldiers maintained a kind of grimness that resembled determination. They held positions. They counterattacked when ordered. They maintained equipment. They did not mutiny or desert in large numbers, even though desertion would have been possible given the chaos of operations and the collapsing discipline of some Wehrmacht units. But this was no longer the fanatical enthusiasm visible in 1941, when men had sung marching songs while moving toward the Soviet Union, believing themselves invincible. This was endurance born from habit, from acceptance of fate, and from the simple fact that dying in place seemed marginally preferable to desertion, which might bring execution by SS officers, or, if captured, almost certain death at Soviet hands. The men had seen Soviet reprisals against German prisoners and against civilians suspected of collaboration with the Germans. The Eastern Front had become a conflict where surrender meant only a different method of dying, and this knowledge drove men to continue fighting even as hope faded. The command structure of the division began to show signs of strain as the autumn advanced. General Theodor Eicke was no longer alive to shape the division's culture. He had been killed over Soviet lines months earlier. His successor as divisional commander, Brigadeführer Matthias Kleinheisterkamp, faced an impossible operational situation. He was receiving orders to hold lines that could not be held with the troops available to him. He was being asked to conduct offensives without adequate ammunition, fuel, or supporting forces. Supply officers reported that the division's transport was being worn to destruction on terrible roads, and replacement vehicles were not arriving. Casualty replacement depots could not keep pace with losses. Officers who had served in the division for years began requesting transfers, not from cowardice, but from the simple recognition that the situation was deteriorating beyond the ability of any tactical skill to manage. The division's remaining strength was being expended like ammunition in artillery barrages, consumed to no strategic purpose beyond delaying the inevitable. The character of the fighting itself began to change as the division retreated westward through Ukraine. The fluid warfare of earlier years, with clear front lines and defined objectives, gave way to something closer to disintegration. Soviet forces, freed from the strategic straitjacket of defending prepared positions, could now exploit German weakness. Breakthrough forces would push westward, and German formations would have to conduct what officers euphemistically called elastic defense, abandonment of territory to avoid encirclement. The Totenkopf Division found itself caught repeatedly in near-pocket situations, forced to abandon equipment and wounded personnel to maintain cohesion and escape Soviet encircling maneuvers. Supply routes were cut, forcing the division to make brutal calculations about which equipment could be destroyed and which could be carried out. Towns and villages that German forces had held for months had to be abandoned in hours. Soviet partisan activity behind German lines intensified, attacking supply convoys and isolated units, adding another layer of danger and unpredictability to operations. The division's soldiers discovered that they were no longer liberators or conquerors. They were fugitives, being pursued by a victorious enemy. By October of 1943, the Totenkopf Division had been pushed back across the Dnieper River and was fighting to maintain a foothold on the western bank. The river itself became a crucial tactical barrier. Soviet forces had to fight their way across it, and German defensive positions briefly became tenable again. The division was reorganized around bridgehead defenses, and men had to be held to their positions through sheer force of will and threat of execution for failure. Divisional records show that replacement drafts arriving in October were significantly smaller than those received in previous months, reflecting both the strain on German training depots and the growing desperation to garrison all the threatened sectors of the front. A large portion of the replacement personnel were ethnic Germans conscripted from occupied territories, or men recovered from hospital duties who were being returned to frontline units before they were fully fit. The expertise level of the division's soldiers, measured in terms of tank gunnery scores, dismounted infantry tactics, and coordination of supporting arms, was declining measurably. The autumn of 1943 just saw the beginning of a transformation that would define the Totenkopf Division's remaining role in the war. It was ceasing to be a cutting instrument, a formation designed to achieve breakthroughs and exploit them into operational victories. It was becoming a blunting instrument, deployed to shore up threatened sectors, to absorb Soviet attacks, to stabilize collapsing lines, and to buy time for other formations to conduct withdrawals. This role required the same tactical and technical skill, perhaps even more so, because defeat was inevitable if the division failed. But it offered no prospect of the kind of strategic success that had animated the division's soldiers, even in the darkest hours of 1942. The men of the Totenkopf Division, bruised and exhausted by 4 months of constant retreat and crisis combat, were beginning to understand that they were no longer fighting a war they believed they could win. They were fighting a war they needed to survive. The cost of this grinding campaign extended beyond the visible losses in men and machines. The psychological transition from soldiers confident in their ideological mission and military superiority to soldiers simply trying to avoid death was profound. Letters captured by Soviet forces or recovered from killed soldiers show an increasing resignation, a loss of certainty, a growing distance between the propaganda they had been trained to believe and the reality visible around them. Soldiers who had volunteered for the Waffen-SS as believers in the cause were becoming simply tired men trying to keep themselves and their comrades alive. Some retained elements of ideological conviction, but it was increasingly an act of will to maintain those beliefs against the evidence of daily experience. The Totenkopf Division in the autumn of 1943 was still a lethal fighting force. It could still inflict severe casualties on Soviet opponents. It could still conduct tactical withdrawals with skill and ferocity, but it was no longer an optimistic force. It was no longer convinced of its ultimate victory. It was, increasingly, a formation fighting against time and fate, and that transformation was written in the exhausted faces of its surviving soldiers and in the thinning ranks of its companies and battalions, as summer turned to autumn and autumn prepared to yield to another terrible Russian winter. In the frozen depths of the Ukrainian winter, as 1943 turned toward 1944, the German armies in the east faced a crisis that would strip away any remaining illusions about where the war was heading. The Totenkopf Division, rebuilt and rearmed over the preceding months, found itself drawn into one of the most desperate operations of the entire campaign. The attempt to rescue a German force that had been surrounded and cut off by the Red Army in a place called Korsun-Cherkasy. The operation would become a nightmare of winter, futility, and mounting losses, a grinding trial that would leave the division further diminished even as it fought with extraordinary ferocity to save its comrades. What unfolded across the frozen steppe was not a clean tactical maneuver, but a kind of organized desperation, a clash between German determination and Soviet numerical superiority, in conditions that seemed designed by nature itself to defeat every human effort. The Totenkopf men who marched into that cauldron in January would emerge with wounds both visible and invisible, their strength as a military formation substantially eroded by an operation that ultimately could not succeed. The encirclement that trapped the German forces had developed over the preceding weeks, as Soviet armies, now operating with increasing coordination and strategic vision, drove deeper into Ukraine, following the German failure at Kursk. 2 entire corps of the German 8th Army, totaling roughly 55,000 men, found themselves cut off and surrounded near the small towns of Korsun and Cherkasy, their escape routes sealed off by Soviet forces who had achieved a rare moment of tactical mastery. The trapped Germans consisted of experienced but worn divisions, units that had fought continuously for more than a year and a half without relief. Supply was problematic at best. The encircled men faced dwindling ammunition, food shortages, and an enemy that pressed against their perimeter with seeming limitless reserves. The High Command in Berlin demanded that this force be rescued, that the trapped men must not be abandoned. Yet the practical means to achieve this rescue were limited, and what reserves existed had to be hastily scraped together and thrown forward under the most difficult imaginable circumstances. The Totenkopf Division, now operating under new command, but still bearing the institutional ferocity that had come to define it, was selected as one of the key elements in the relief column. The operation was placed under the overall coordination of General Hans Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, which marshaled whatever mobile forces could be extracted from the surrounding sectors. The Totenkopf would fight as part of a desperate spearhead, a battering ram meant to punch through Soviet lines and open a corridor through which the encircled troops could escape. The division had known cold before. The horror of Demyansk had burned that particular hell into the memory of every survivor. But Korsun-Cherkasy would be different. Not because the cold was worse, but because there seemed no end to it. No clear victory condition that would justify the losses being suffered. The men understood, with the grim clarity that veteran soldiers develop, that they were being sent to do something that might not be possible, and that success or failure would matter little in the larger scheme of a war that was already shifting away from Germany. The journey toward the pocket was itself a trial. The roads were barely passable, quagmires of mud and ice that slowed the movement of heavy equipment to a crawl. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, and the Totenkopf men experienced the peculiar torture of trying to maintain combat readiness while conserving enough heat in their bodies to stay functional. The division's armored vehicles, their engines struggling in the cold, had to be nursed forward with constant attention and repairs. Fuel was sluggish, moving like honey, sometimes refusing to flow at all until drums were heated. Officers learned to check on their men constantly, watching for the early signs of frostbite and hypothermia that could render soldiers' combat ineffective as surely as a bullet wound. The Soviet forces, operating from positions they had carefully prepared, waited with the knowledge that time and cold were working in their favor. They had no need to hurry. The Germans would come to them, and every hour that passed was an hour in which the encircled troops inside the pocket grew hungrier, colder, and more desperate. When the Totenkopf Division made contact with Soviet positions on the perimeter of the encirclement, the fighting that erupted was desperate and chaotic. The division pushed with extraordinary aggression, its panzer grenadiers and panzer troops advancing through a landscape that offered no cover and no mercy. The Soviets, well entrenched and numerous, met these assaults with a concentration of fire that seemed to pour from every direction. The terrain itself became an enemy. The frozen ground, which seemed like it should be firm, was treacherous beneath snow that concealed ditches and shell craters. Vehicle casualties mounted rapidly. Men who bailed out of knocked-out tanks faced the twin certainties of combat wounds and lethal cold. The Totenkopf veterans, men who had fought across thousands of kilometers in this vast, brutal theater, threw themselves at the Soviet positions with a kind of controlled fury. But controlled fury was not enough. The Soviet defensive positions had been constructed with care, with overlapping fields of fire that created killing zones into which the Germans had to advance. Progress, when it came at all, was measured in hundreds of meters, purchased at terrifying cost in men and machines. The relief column made progress, but it was maddeningly slow, and as the days passed into weeks, the psychological toll on the men became as significant as the physical casualties. The trapped troops inside the pocket began to despair. Signals indicated that they could not hold much longer, that rations were exhausted, and that their perimeter was collapsing under Soviet pressure. The Totenkopf men, exhausted and depleted, understood that they were racing against forces they could not ultimately control. The cold seemed to penetrate everything. Uniforms offered almost no protection, and men's fingers began to fail them, making it nearly impossible to operate weapons or carry ammunition. Cases of frostbite multiplied, and the forward aid stations worked frantically to treat soldiers who were being brought back, so frozen they could barely speak. Officers made decisions about who could continue fighting and who had to be pulled back before they became casualties, rather than combatants. The division's strength, never replaced after the battles of the preceding months, was being ground away at a rate that could not be sustained. By late January, it became clear that a single coordinated breakthrough was not going to be possible. The trapped forces would have to break out under their own power, attempting to fight their way through the Soviet encirclement toward the relief column, rather than waiting for the relief column to reach them. What followed was perhaps the most harrowing operation of the entire campaign. Tens of thousands of exhausted, hungry, desperate German soldiers attempting to break through Soviet lines in a winter night, with minimal protection and almost no certainty of survival. The Totenkopf Division was positioned to cover this breakout, to hold open the corridor through which the trapped men would attempt their desperate flight. In the chaos of that night, in conditions where visibility was almost nil and the cold seemed to become a physical force, something between catastrophe and partial success occurred. Some of the trapped troops made it through. Many did not. Soldiers froze to death during the attempted breakthrough. Others were captured. Still others were cut off and forced to surrender, as dawn revealed the horror of the night's fighting. The division's role as fire brigade continued even as the breakout operation unfolded. Totenkopf units had to maintain their positions against repeated Soviet assaults, had to hold the corridor open long enough for the maximum number of trapped men to escape, and simultaneously had to protect themselves against annihilation. The men were beyond exhaustion now. They were operating on an adrenaline and institutional reflex that had little to do with individual strength or will. Equipment failures multiplied. Vehicles broke down and had to be abandoned. Ammunition ran dangerously low. The division's command staff faced the grim reality that they did not have enough men or machines to accomplish what was being demanded of them. Yet the orders kept coming. Hold here, advance there, cover that withdrawal, repel that attack. The human capacity for endurance was being tested to its absolute limits, and in many cases, those limits were exceeded. By the time the Korsun-Cherkasy operation reached its conclusion in early February of 1944, a catastrophic toll had been exacted on the division. Casualties, counted in the thousands, had reduced the Totenkopf to perhaps half its operational strength at the beginning of the operation. Equipment losses were equally severe. Tanks and self-propelled guns knocked out or abandoned. Half-tracks destroyed. Field kitchens lost to the advancing cold and enemy action. The men who remained were psychologically transformed by the experience. No longer the relatively confident armored troops who had faced the Soviets at Kursk just months before. They had learned something in the Russian winter that no amount of training could have taught them. The feeling of inevitable defeat, the knowledge that their nation's military power was finally, clearly beginning to fail. The trapped forces had lost staggering numbers, with estimates suggesting that more than half of the 55,000 men who had been encircled were killed, captured, or missing. That the Totenkopf Division had fought as hard as any unit in German service was undeniable. That their efforts had been insufficient was equally clear. The division was withdrawn from the immediate sector for rest and reconstitution, but any hope for genuine recovery was impossible. The manpower replacement system, never adequate even at the war's beginning, had now become almost completely dysfunctional. Casualties were replaced by increasingly younger men, with progressively less training, mixed together with older soldiers, filling gaps in the ranks. The cohesion that had made the Totenkopf Division so formidable in combat began to fracture under the sheer weight of accumulated losses and the psychological weight of operating in a war that seemed increasingly unwinnable. Officers and NCOs who had survived from the formation's earliest days found themselves commanding men they had never trained and leading units that bore little resemblance to the formations that had fought in France or even at Kursk. The equipment situation was equally grim. The division received replacements, but never in sufficient quantity or quality to restore full capability. What made Korsun-Cherkasy truly significant was not that it represented any kind of tactical defeat. The Totenkopf Division had fought as hard as any unit could be asked to fight. Rather, it represented the point at which even the most fanatical and well-trained formations began to confront the reality that they were operating in a war they could no longer win, only delay. The division would continue to fight, would participate in subsequent operations, would display courage and tactical skill until the very end. But something essential had broken in the crucible of the frozen steppe. The men had begun to understand, in a way that no amount of Nazi Party ideology could overcome, that their sacrifice was not leading to victory, but merely postponing inevitable defeat. The Korsun-Cherkasy pocket, more than any earlier operation, marked the invisible line between a German army that still believed in its potential and one that had begun to understand the true nature of its doom. The Totenkopf Division would cross that line in January of 1944, and it would never cross back. By 1944, the arithmetic of the Eastern Front had become brutally simple. The Totenkopf Division, like every German formation east of the Vistula, was being ground to dust between the hammer of Soviet offensives and the anvil of their own dwindling resources. After the disaster at Korsun-Cherkasy in the winter of 43 to 44, what remained of the division was no longer the formidable armored force that had terrorized the Ukrainian steppes. It was a shell, a unit existing more in the order of battle than in actual combat strength. The men who survived those frozen weeks limped westward with frostbite scars, missing comrades, and the creeping realization that the war they had once expected to win was no longer winnable. Yet the machinery of the Reich ground on. Orders arrived, commands were restructured, and in the spring of 1944, the remnants of the Totenkopf Division were pulled out of the line, refitted as best as depleted German industry could manage, and redirected southward toward Hungary. What they were being sent into was not a new victory, or even a stable defensive line. It was a theater of collapse, masquerading as strategy. Hungary, in 1944, occupied an impossible position in the German war machine. It was no longer a genuinely subordinate ally, but neither was it yet an enemy in open revolt. The Hungarian government, under Admiral Horthy, had been growing increasingly reluctant as the war turned against Germany, but it remained formally tied to the Axis and, crucially, it sat atop the oil fields of Ploshty and the reserves that still fueled German tanks, trucks, and aircraft. For Hitler, Hungary had become the last territory in Europe where petroleum could still be extracted and refined with some hope of reaching German lines. As Soviet forces crashed through Romania in August of 1944, following the country's sudden defection to the Allies, Hungary transformed overnight from a secure rear area into a frontline state. The Soviet advance was rapid, relentless, and entirely predictable in its trajectory. By autumn, Soviet mechanized columns were probing across the Hungarian border. The Germans faced a choice between abandoning Hungary entirely or committing mobile reserves to hold it. Hitler chose to fight. The Totenkopf Division, along with other SS panzer formations, was designated as one of the instruments through which he would attempt to maintain control of this strategically critical territory. The journey southward into Hungary, for men of the Totenkopf Division, meant descending into territory that was culturally foreign and militarily deteriorating. Veterans of the division, men who had fought across Russia and Ukraine, suddenly found themselves in a landscape of low hills, narrow valleys, and agricultural plains that offered little of the defensive depth to which they had become accustomed. The Hungarian population presented an ambiguous picture. There were villages that appeared almost untouched by war, civilians who seemed to have no comprehension of the grinding catastrophe occurring to the east. There were also signs of fracturing loyalty. Hungarian soldiers whose commitment to fighting at Germany's side was visibly waning. The division arrived not as conquerors, or even as confident defenders, but as reinforcements, whose presence was meant to stiffen the wavering. Officers understood this instinctively. Men understood it too. This was no longer a war of conquest, or even of holding territory against tactical reverses. This was a war of buying time in a shrinking space. The division's mission was fundamentally reactive, defensive, and temporary in nature, though no one said so aloud. Discipline remained sharp, training remained vigorous, but the psychological substrate had shifted. These were soldiers who had seen the endless steps of the Soviet Union and had learned what lay beyond German lines. In a nation of 170 million people, Hungary felt like standing at the edge of a chasm. The strategic situation that greeted the Totenkopf Division was no less troubling than the psychological terrain. Soviet forces, under Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin, were advancing through the Balkans with staggering momentum. Romania's defection in late August 1944 had shattered the entire southern flank of the German defensive system. What had been a relatively stable front became overnight a nightmare scenario for German planners. Soviet mechanized columns were driving northwestward toward the Danube, threatening to encircle Budapest itself and cut off the entire Hungarian theater. German commanders in the region were frantically attempting to improvise defensive positions, but they were working with insufficient forces and no possibility of reinforcement from the already catastrophic situation on the central and northern fronts. The Totenkopf Division's arrival was met with a mix of relief and resignation. At least here was an elite formation with recent combat experience, equipped with tanks and self-propelled guns, capable of fighting with initiative and aggression. But every officer knew that no single division, however skilled, could stop the Soviet mechanized forces now grinding toward Hungary. The mathematics were simply not there. The Germans could delay, inflict casualties, fall back in better order than they might otherwise have done, but the trajectory was predetermined. The war would be lost. What remained was only the manner and speed of losing it. Into the summer and autumn of 1944, the Totenkopf Division was committed to a series of defensive battles across the Hungarian plain and along the approaches to Budapest. These were not battles of maneuver or breakthrough, but grinding attritional engagements where relatively small German formations attempted to harass and disrupt larger Soviet attacking forces. The terrain offered few natural advantages. The Hungarian plain is broad and relatively flat, offering limited defensive positions and little scope for the kind of mobile warfare in which German panzer divisions traditionally excelled. Against Soviet armored columns, German tank crews fought from prepared positions, attempting to use the superior gun accuracy of their Panthers and Tigers to offset the numerical superiority of Soviet T-34s. The battles were savage and brief, units engaging for hours, or sometimes days, before being forced to fall back to the next prepared position. Casualties accumulated steadily. Tank losses mounted. The supply situation was chronic and worsening. The Totenkopf Division was experiencing in Hungary what every German formation was experiencing across all fronts in 1944, the slow, inexorable attrition of a nation no longer capable of replacing its losses in men or material. The oil fields represented the hidden geometry of the entire Hungarian campaign. Ploesti and the refineries associated with it had been the target of repeated Allied bombing raids throughout the war, but they were still producing petroleum products that the German army desperately needed. For Hitler, holding the Hungarian plain was fundamentally about protecting these oil fields from falling into Soviet hands or remaining under Soviet control. It was a war of logistics and resources, disguised as a war of territory. The Totenkopf Division understood this only dimly, and mostly through the frequency with which they were ordered to hold or counterattack specific positions that seemed to have no obvious military value, but through which the supply lines to the refineries ran. Men were dying to protect oil that might reach a tank or an aircraft somewhere else in the shrinking German sphere. It was a peculiar and dispiriting form of warfare, all the more so because everyone understood that the oil fields would ultimately be lost anyway. The Soviets had both the numbers and the momentum to overcome anything the Germans could put in their path. The only question was how much time could be bought and at what cost. These calculations, ruthless and mathematical, governed the conduct of the division throughout 1944. By the autumn of 1944, the focus of the campaign had shifted increasingly toward Budapest itself. The Hungarian capital had become not only the symbolic center of German resistance in the Balkans, but also the geographical focus of command and supply. As Soviet forces drew closer, Budapest took on the character of a fortress city, fortified against both direct assault and siege. The Totenkopf Division, by now considerably reduced in strength and depleted in equipment, was deployed in defensive positions around and within the approaches to Budapest. Officers attempted to construct defensive lines, fallback positions, and strong points that could at least delay a Soviet assault. The division was also increasingly involved in securing the city itself against internal threats. Hungary's loyalty to the German cause was fragmenting visibly. There was passive resistance, acts of sabotage, and growing signs that the Hungarian government was attempting to arrange a separate peace with the Soviets. The Totenkopf Division found itself not only fighting a conventional military enemy, but also managing an increasingly unstable political situation, attempting to guarantee German control of a capital city whose population was increasingly hostile or indifferent to German rule. The realization that they were fighting to delay an inevitable outcome rather than to win grew more acute as 1944 passed into 1945. Soldiers of the Totenkopf Division, many of them veterans of multiple years of continuous warfare, understood the fundamental strategic picture perhaps more clearly than the German high command that continued to issue orders as though victory were still possible. They could read maps. They could understand the disparity in numbers, the collapse of German allies, the relentless Soviet advance from the east, and the Allied advance from the west. The division's morale, though maintained through rigorous discipline, was no longer the fanatical ideological zeal that had characterized the unit's earlier campaigns. This was a different phenomenon entirely. It was the discipline of professional soldiers who had learned that survival required obedience to orders, competence in execution, and acceptance of circumstances that were beyond their control. Veterans carried photographs of home, or what home had been before the bombing. They wrote letters home with increasing desperation. There were suicides among the officers. There were instances of men attempting to desert, knowing that Soviet capture meant almost certain death. The Totenkopf Division was no longer a formation fighting in the service of an ideology that seemed achievable. It had become a formation fighting for survival in the wreckage of a collapsing state. The division's equipment situation in Hungary deteriorated steadily through 1944 and into 1945. Panzers that broke down could not be repaired because the transport links necessary to move them to repair facilities were under constant Soviet interdiction. Tank losses could not be replaced because German factories were no longer producing tanks in sufficient quantities to compensate for combat attrition. The division was forced to improvise, to cannibalize damaged vehicles, to keep others running, to employ old captured Soviet tanks and improvise self-propelled guns because there was nothing else available. The engineering and maintenance sections of the division performed miracles of improvisation, but miracles could not overcome the fundamental reality that Germany no longer had the industrial base to sustain a war against the Soviet Union. Men who had learned to operate specific weapons types had to learn to operate others. Crews had to be reorganized and retrained. The seamless integration of mechanized forces that had been the hallmark of the Totenkopf Division at its peak was replaced by a patchwork apparatus held together by desperation and professional competence. The relationship between the Totenkopf Division and the Hungarian military establishment was complex and increasingly strained. Hungarian units, varying greatly in their commitment and capability, were theoretically subordinate to German command, but the reality was far more ambiguous. Hungarian officers were increasingly unreliable. Some were attempting to arrange a separate peace with the Soviets. Some were more concerned with preserving their own formations than with coordinating with the Germans. The Totenkopf Division found itself having to assume defensive responsibilities that Hungarian units could not or would not assume. Officers of the division had to spend as much time managing Hungarian affairs as they did managing their own operations. In some instances, German units had to take security measures against Hungarian military elements to prevent sabotage or coordinated betrayal. It was a nightmare scenario for any modern military force, attempting to conduct operations in the presence of politically unreliable allies, while simultaneously facing a militarily superior enemy. The division's commanders understood that they were fighting in a theater where political collapse would ultimately matter far more than tactical competence. The arrival of Hungarian Arrow Cross fascists, hardline Nazi collaborators, who were gradually consolidating control in Budapest through 1944 and into 1945, created a new dimension to the military situation. The Totenkopf Division increasingly found itself not only defending against Soviet forces, but also enforcing internal security for the German-backed regime against popular resistance and armed opposition. This was a war within the larger war, and it consumed resources and attention that were already desperately stretched. Men of the division were deployed on city security operations, on anti-partisan sweeps, on enforcement actions that bore no relationship to conventional military operations. For veterans of 6 years of warfare, these duties were particularly corrosive to morale. They felt like the acts of occupiers rather than soldiers. The division was fighting on territory that was becoming hostile to German rule, even as German military capacity to control that territory continued to decline. It was a paradox that no amount of discipline or ideology could overcome. By the early months of 1945, the Totenkopf Division in Hungary faced the prospect of Soviet encirclement. The Soviets had broken through in multiple sectors. The German lines were fragmenting. Supplies were running critically short. The possibility of being trapped and forced to surrender or fight to destruction became an increasingly present reality. Plans were hastily drawn up for the division's retreat westward, if retreat became necessary or possible. Officers began to consider the prospect of fighting their way westward to surrender to Western Allied forces, rather than remaining in position to be overwhelmed by the Soviets. The psychological atmosphere in the division shifted toward a kind of fatalistic resignation. Men understood that the war was ending. They understood that their defeat was not a matter of if, but of when, and under what circumstances. The hope that had sustained them, however dim it had become, was reduced now to simple hopes for survival and the possibility of being captured by the correct victors. The Totenkopf Division had come to Hungary to defend an oil field and a capital city, to hold territory against the advance of the Red Army, to buy time for the Reich. It had accomplished none of these things. It had only delayed, at terrible cost in men and material, an outcome that was never in doubt. Hungary, with its plains and its fragile cities, had become for the Totenkopf Division the last theatre of a war that had no future. The division would not remain there much longer. The collapse would come soon enough. And when it came, few would remember the battles fought across these plains with anything other than the bitter knowledge that they had been fought for nothing. In the winter of 1944, as Soviet forces closed in on Budapest with remorseless momentum, Adolf Hitler conceived of a desperate remedy. The Danube crossings south of the Hungarian capital had been lost to the Red Army. The oil fields around Lake Balaton, which Germany needed to fuel whatever remained of its war machine, lay exposed to Soviet capture. Rather than accept further retreat, Hitler resolved on one final major armored offensive. The operation was codenamed Spring Awakening. It would be launched in March of 1945. Its objective was to recapture the initiative on the Eastern Front and restore German control of the strategic territory that the Wehrmacht could no longer afford to lose. The Totenkopf Division, along with the Leibstandarte and Das Reich divisions of the 6th Panzer Army, would form the spearhead. Among the German command structure, however, few harbored genuine optimism. They understood what Hitler, in his isolation, seemed unwilling to accept. The war was already lost. The strategic situation in Hungary had deteriorated steadily throughout the winter. Soviet Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's forces had driven westward in a relentless advance that left German defenders scrambling to form new defensive lines in terrain that offered little protection. Budapest itself, surrounded and bombarded, had become a symbol of German desperation. The city's garrison held out in appalling conditions, while the Wehrmacht desperately sought to organize a relief force. Hitler's solution was not to defend more effectively, but to attack. The concentration of armor for Spring Awakening was genuinely impressive on paper. Panzer divisions were pulled from defensive sectors across the Eastern Front. Fresh Panther tanks, Tigers, and Ferdinand tank destroyers were assembled in unprecedented numbers for what Hitler described as a war-winning blow. In reality, these forces represented nearly the last reserves of German armored capability. Once committed, they could not be reconstituted. The very desperation that made the offensive seem necessary also made it doomed from the outset. The Totenkopf Division had been rebuilt substantially in the preceding months. Its strength stood at roughly 7,800 men, organized into mechanized infantry battalions, supported by tank companies, equipped with Panther tanks and Sturmgeschütz assault guns. Its divisional artillery was formidable. Its men, predominantly survivors of the Eastern Front, possessed the harsh tactical knowledge that only years of combat could instill. Many had fought at Kharkov, had endured Kursk, had participated in the desperate rearguard actions of the preceding year. They were not the ideologically fervent recruits of 1941. They were hardened soldiers who understood the mathematics of their situation with clarity that their high command seemed to lack. When orders came down in March for the division to prepare for a major offensive, the reception among officers and men was complicated. There was professional readiness to execute the operation. There was also a pervasive fatalism about its prospects and its ultimate purpose. The offensive was scheduled to launch on the 6th of March 1945. The Totenkopf Division, along with sister SS Panzer divisions, would attack southeastward from the Veszprém area toward Lake Balaton, aiming to break through Soviet lines and recapture the vital crossings of the Danube. The preliminary bombardment commenced according to plan. Divisional artillery massed in preparation for the infantry assault. Tank companies moved into attack formations. The Totenkopf's assault battalions fixed bayonets and prepared to advance into the teeth of Soviet defensive positions that had been occupied and reinforced for weeks. As dawn broke across the Hungarian plain on that March morning, the offensive began. Initial German assault waves pressed forward with the discipline and tactical competence that had become the hallmark of the Totenkopf's operations. Soviet defensive lines absorbed the first German attacks. The fighting was savage and immediate. The Totenkopf's infantry pushed forward through artillery fire and anti-tank guns, their tactical formations disciplined, their objectives clear. For the first 2 days, German forces achieved a tactical surprise that allowed limited penetrations of the Soviet forward positions. The Totenkopf Division and its sister formations drove several kilometers into Soviet territory. Casualties were heavy, but not immediately catastrophic. There existed, for a brief window, a genuine possibility that the offensive might achieve meaningful gains. However, Soviet response was swift and overwhelming. Marshal Tolbuchin's reserve forces, which had been held back in anticipation of precisely such a German offensive, moved into the lines to reinforce the battered defensive positions. Artillery concentrations of Soviet scale and density began to rain down on German formations, operating in the open terrain with insufficient air cover. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and pilots, could offer only minimal support. Soviet anti-tank guns and tank brigades began to inflict severe losses on German armor. The momentum of the German attack, fragile from its inception, began to dissipate on the second and third day of the offensive. What had begun as a dramatic German assault rapidly transformed into a grinding, costly struggle against an enemy that held every advantage. By the 8th and 9th of March, it had become clear to every officer in the chain of command that spring awakening was failing. The Totenkopf Division was suffering mounting casualties in men and irreplaceable armor. Tank losses mounted as Soviet anti-tank defenses stiffened, and Soviet mechanized reserves arrived to contest every piece of terrain. The divisional commander was receiving reports of Soviet mechanized corps maneuvering to envelop the German penetration from both flanks. German supply lines, already stretched, began to collapse under the weight of Soviet interdiction. Ammunition resupply became irregular. Fuel supplies, always a critical constraint, dwindled alarmingly. In the headquarters of the 6th Panzer Army, under Sepp Dietrich, a paralyzing realization took hold. The offensive had to be called off. The question was whether to attempt this withdrawal in an orderly fashion or to continue throwing men and machines into a battle that could no longer be won. Dietrich, viewing the tactical situation with clear eyes, recommended halting the offensive and withdrawing to more defensible positions. Such counsel, when it reached Hitler's ears at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, provoked a response of towering rage. Hitler's response to the failure of Spring Awakening was to fix blame not on his own orders or on the impossible strategic situation, but on the SS Panzer divisions and on Sepp Dietrich personally. The Führer was convinced that the SS formations, which he had long viewed as the most fanatical and reliable elements of the German military, had somehow lost their nerve or deliberately sabotaged his grand design. This conviction had no basis in operational reality. The failure of Spring Awakening resulted from overwhelming Soviet numbers, superior Soviet logistics, the exhaustion of German reserves, and the fact that no operation could restore German military capacity when that capacity had fundamentally eroded. Nevertheless, Hitler's fury found expression in a decree of spectacular humiliation. On the 21st of March 1945, Hitler issued an order stating that the SS Panzer divisions, including the Totenkopf Division, were to be stripped of their honorary cuff titles as a punishment for their alleged failure in Hungary. The cuff title was not merely a decoration. It was a sacred symbol of SS identity and loyalty, representing membership in an elite formation that traced its lineage directly to Hitler's person and authority. The stripping of these titles was intended as a profound disgrace, a rejection by the Führer himself. The impact on the Totenkopf Division and its sister SS formations was seismic. Men who had fought with fanatical commitment from the opening days of Barbarossa felt cast adrift by the leader they had been indoctrinated to revere absolutely. The cuff titles were removed from uniforms across the entire division. The order itself was published to the troops, so that the extent of the Führer's displeasure would be comprehended from the lowest private upward. Among the officer corps, the response ranged from shock to something resembling a bitter clarity that their supreme commander had finally, visibly, lost contact with reality. How could formations that had bled at Demyansk, held the line at Kursk, and fought the grinding Eastern Front for nearly 4 years be suddenly labeled as failures because of a single failed offensive? The psychological impact was devastating. The ideological cement that had bound the SS Totenkopf together began to crack under the weight of this rejection. Officers who had served Hitler with absolute devotion experienced a rupture of faith that could not be fully healed in the few weeks remaining before Germany's final collapse. Yet the division continued to function. Sepp Dietrich formally protested Hitler's order, a gesture that was extraordinary for an SS officer and symbolized the depth of the breach between the Führer and his formerly most devoted subordinates. The Totenkopf's remaining officers reorganized the division for defensive operations. The operation in Hungary had cost the division roughly 1,500 casualties, representing a loss of nearly 20% of its combat strength. Irrecoverable tank losses amounted to roughly 80 Panther and Sturmgeschütz vehicles. These losses could not be replaced. The division's surviving armor was consolidated into smaller, more defensible groupings. The organization shifted toward defensive operations, with realistic expectations of slowing Soviet advances rather than halting or reversing them. The men adapted, as soldiers do, to their changed circumstances. Some attempted to apply for transfers out of SS service. The vast majority remained in the division, bound by oath, by habit, and by the simple fact that the war continued regardless of their wishes. The weeks following Spring Awakening became a final agony of delaying actions across the Hungarian plain. The Totenkopf Division, reduced in strength and demoralized by Hitler's actions, fought rearguard battles that achieved tactical successes without strategic meaning. Soviet forces continued to press westward. Budapest fell in February of 1945, its garrison either killed or captured. German forces that had sought to relieve the city found themselves fighting simply to maintain cohesion as they withdrew. The Totenkopf participated in these operations, contesting Soviet advances with the professionalism that had become ingrained in its officer corps, but without the ideological fervor that had once animated its assault. This was a different kind of fighting. It lacked the certainty of purpose that had characterized the division's operations in its earlier years. Men fought because they were soldiers, and because the alternative was death or capture. Many harbored private doubts about what, precisely, they were defending in the final weeks of the Reich. The shadow of potential war crimes prosecution also began to weigh more heavily on the officers and men of the Totenkopf Division in these final months. They had received reports and rumors of Soviet intentions to try German officers and soldiers for violations of the laws of war. The treatment of Soviet prisoners and civilians during the division's years on the Eastern Front was known to some degree by all ranks.